Hey guys, tonight, we're stepping into the grimy, pungent world of Victorian hygiene, or the lack thereof. Picture yourself in 19th century London, weaving through crowded streets where the air's thick with coal smoke and something far worse. Your boots squish on cobblestones, slick with mystery sludge, and every breath carries a whiff of decay. This isn't the polished corset and top hat vibe of a Jane Austen novel. No, you're in the gritty underbelly of an era where staying clean was a luxury. And frankly, you probably won't survive this without gagging at least once. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with your city and local time. I'm curious where you're chilling tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in the heart of a Victorian city, and the first thing that hits you is the smell. It's not just one odor, but a symphony of stenches, rotting food, human waste, and the acrid tang of unwashed bodies packed too close. The streets are your introduction to a world where hygiene wasn't just neglected, it was barely understood. Open sewers run alongside the roads, and you sidestep a trickle of foul liquid that's definitely not rainwater. Horses clop by leaving piles of manure that no one's in a hurry to clean up. Street sweepers, mostly kids as young as 7, push the worst of it into piles, but that's about as good as it gets. Fun fact, these kids called crossing sweepers made a living clearing paths for fancy folks' shoes, earning a penny or two for their trouble. Not exactly a glamorous gig, but it kept them from starving. Now let's talk about why it's so bad. The Industrial Revolution's in full swing, and cities like London are bursting at the seams. Factories churn out goods and pollution at a breakneck pace, while rural folks flood in for work, cramming into slums where 10 people might share a single room. Historians estimate London's population doubled between 1800 and 1850, hitting over 2 million. That's a lot of bodies, and not nearly enough infrastructure to handle them. Sewers, where they exist, are little more than open ditches, and most waste ends up in the Thames, which, spoiler alert, doubles as the city's drinking water. Yeah, you're already rethinking that glass of water on your nightstand, aren't you? But here's a quirky tidbit. Some Victorians believed the stench itself was deadly. They called it miasma, this idea that bad smells carried disease. So instead of cleaning up the streets, they'd burn herbs or wave perfumed hankies under their noses. Historians still argue whether this miasma theory delayed real sanitation reforms or just reflected how little they knew about germs. Either way, you're stuck dodging these smells, and there's no hanky fancy enough to save you. You keep walking, and the sensory assault doesn't let up. The air's gritty with soot from factory chimneys coating your skin and clothes in a fine black dust. Your throat scratches with every breath, and you notice people coughing deep, rattling hacks that hint at worse to come. Tuberculosis, known as consumption, was a major killer thriving in these filthy, overcrowded conditions. The streets are a breeding ground for disease, but nobody's connecting the dots yet. You pass a market stall selling wilted cabbage and questionable meat swarmed by flies. A woman haggles over a loaf of bread, her hand smudged with grime. You wonder when she last washed them. Spoiler, probably not recently. Let's zoom in on the people around you. Their clothes, even the nice ones, are stiff with dirt. Washing is a hassle, water's hard to come by, and soap's a luxury. Most folks wear the same outfit for days, maybe weeks, until it's practically standing on its own. You spot a dandy in a top hat, looking sharp from a distance, but up close, his collar's dingy and his cuffs are frayed. Even the rich can't fully escape the grime. Oh, and here's a little Victorian humor for you. They called a dirty shirt a 3-day collar because you'd wear it until it was stiff enough to choke you. Bet you're glad for your washing machine now. You're starting to feel the itch of this place on your skin. The lack of hygiene isn't just a public problem, it's personal. Bathing's rare, and when it happens, it's a production. Most homes don't have running water, so you'd need to haul buckets from a pump, or, well then, heat them over a fire. Even then, the water's often cloudy, pulled from the same rivers where sewage flows. You're not just dirty, you're at risk every time you try to get clean. And don't even think about privacy. In a crowded tenement, you're lucky if you get a corner to splash in. As you weave through the crowd, you notice something else than noise. Hawkers shout, cartwheels creak, and somewhere a dog's barking. It's chaotic, but there's a strange rhythm to it, like the city's heartbeat. You pass a pub, its windows fogged with steam and the sour smell of ale. Inside, men slump over tables, their faces ruddy from drink and lack of sleep. You're tempted to step in, but the thought of what's floating in that beer stops you. Hygiene's not just about bodies, it's about everything you touch, eat, or breathe. Here's another weird one for you. Some folks thought dirt was protective, like a good layer of grime could shield you from disease. Sounds nuts now, but when you're surrounded by this much filth, maybe it's easier to lean into the chaos. You're not buying it, though. Your modern brain's screaming for a shower, and you're only a few streets into this journey. Don't worry, we've got a long way to go, and it's only going to get grimier. You turn a corner and nearly trip over a pile of rags. It moves, and you realize it's a person curled up in an alley. Homelessness is rampant, and for them, hygiene isn't even a distant dream. You feel a pang of guilt, but there's little you can do. The city's a machine, grinding up anyone who can't keep up. You keep moving, the stench trailing you like a shadow. This is Victorian hygiene in its rawest form, a battle against a world that's dirty, dangerous, and utterly unforgiving. You're still trudging through the muck of Victorian London, the stench from those open sewers clinging to you like a bad memory. Remember that symphony of smells from the streets? Well, now you're getting up close and personal with its source. You turn down a narrow alley, and there it is, a sluggish brown stream of raw sewage oozing along the ground. It's not just a trickle, it's a full-on flood spilling from overworked drains and backyard privies. You hold your breath and step carefully, but the slop's everywhere, soaking the hem of your clothes. Welcome to the reality of Victorian waste management, where management is a generous term. This isn't just gross, it's a daily hazard you can't escape. The city's sewer system, if you can call it that, is a patchwork of ancient ditches and half-hearted pipes built for a population a fraction of what it is now. By the 1840s, London's pumping out more waste than its crumbling infrastructure can handle. Most of it ends up in the streets, or the Thames, which you're starting to realize is less a river and more a giant toilet. Historical records show that in 1858, the Great Stink hit, when the Thames smelled so bad, Parliament had to hang lime-soaked curtains to keep working. But you're not there yet. This is just a regular bad day. And it's bad enough. You dodge a splash as a cart rumbles by its wheels, churning the filth into a fine mist. Bet you're rethinking that morning coffee now. Here's where it gets quirky. Some enterprising folks saw this mess as opportunity. Night soil. Men roamed the city collecting human waste from cesspits to sell as fertilizer. Sounds like a niche side hustle, right? Except the job was as grim as it gets, wading through literal rivers of poop for pennies. You spot one now, a gaunt man with a shovel, his clothes stained in ways you don't want to think about. He's hauling buckets to a cart, and the smell makes your eyes water. You give him a wide berth, but you can't help wondering how he stands it. Historians still argue whether these workers were unsung heroes of sanitation or just desperate souls stuck with the worst gig in town. You keep moving, but the sewage problem's not just a street issue, it's personal. Most homes, especially in the slums, don't have indoor plumbing. Instead, you've got privies, rickety outhouses in backyards, shared by dozens of families. You peek into one and immediately regret it. The wooden seat's splintered, the pit below is overflowing, and flies are having a field day. You're supposed to do your business here, but the thought makes your stomach lurch. Worse, these privies often leak into nearby wells, contaminating the water you drink. It's a vicious cycle, and you're caught in it, whether you're a factory worker or a fancy lord. Let's talk about the people around you. You pass a woman dumping a bucket of slop into the street, her hands raw from scrubbing. She's not aiming for the sewer, she's just getting it out of her house. Nobody's coming to collect this stuff regularly, so it piles up until it spills over. You notice kids playing nearby barefoot, splashing in puddles that are definitely not water. Your modern brain's screaming about germs, but germ theory's still a few decades away. These folks think disease comes from bad air, not the filth they're wading through. It's frustrating, but you can't exactly pull out a microbiology textbook and start preaching. The sensory overload's relentless. The air's damp with the sour tang of waste, and your boots are caked with who knows what. You try to focus on something else, but the sounds don't help: cartwheels, squelching dogs yapping, and the occasional shout as someone slips in the muck. Oh, here's a grim Victorian joke for you. They called a particularly bad alley a stink trap, because once you were in, the smell wouldn't let you go. Kind of like a bad date, but with more cholera. You're starting to feel the weight of this place. Every step's a reminder that hygiene isn't just about staying clean, it's about survival. Cholera's a constant threat, and it's no mystery why. The disease spread through contaminated water, killed tens of thousands in Victorian Britain. In 1831, the first major outbreak hit, wiping out entire neighborhoods. You pass a boarded-up house, its windows dark, and wonder if cholera claimed the family inside. The fear's palpable, but nobody's figured out the water connection yet. You're tempted to warn them, but you'd probably get locked up for sounding like a lunatic. Let's zoom out for a second. This sewage nightmare's not just a London problem. It's every industrial city in Victorian Britain. Manchester, Birmingham, Liverpool, they're all drowning in their own waste. The middle and upper classes might escape to cleaner suburbs, but you're in the thick of it, where the poor live and die. You pass a tenement, its walls damp with mold, and hear a baby crying inside. The air's so thick, you can taste it, and it's not a flavor you'll forget. You're starting to understand why life expectancy in these slums hovers around 30. But here's another oddity. Some Victorians thought sewage could be a health tonic. Yeah, you heard that right. Quack doctors peddled sewage baths as cures for everything from rheumatism to bad skin. Imagine soaking in a tub of what you're dodging in the streets. Hard pass. Right. You're not falling for it. But plenty did, desperate for any fix. In a world where medicine's more guesswork than science. You keep walking the alley opening into a wider street, but the sewage follows. It's in the gutters, the cracks in the pavement, the very air you breathe. You spot a pump where people are filling buckets, and your stomach twists. That water's probably laced with the same filth you're avoiding. You're thirsty, but you'd rather chew gravel than drink from there. The irony's cruel in a city surrounded by water. Clean water's rarer than gold. As you move on, you notice the effort it takes to stay upright. The ground's slick, and every step's a gamble. You pass a man mopping his brow with a grimy hanky, his face streaked with soot and sweat. He's probably headed to a factory, where the filth's just a different flavor machine, oil and dust, instead of sewage. You're starting to see the pattern. Dirt's not an exception here. It's the rule. From the streets to the homes, to the people, it's a world built on grime. You're itching for a break, but there's no clean corner to rest in. The city's a machine, and you're just a cog grinding through the muck. You pass a church, its steeple piercing the smog, and for a moment, you're tempted to duck inside. But the smells followed you, and you know it's no sanctuary. This is Victorian hygiene at its core, a constant losing battle against a tide of filth. You're not sure how much more you can take, but you keep going, one careful step at a time. You've escaped the sewage-flooded alleys for now, but the grime of Victorian London still clings to you. Your boots are heavy with muck, and the air's no kinder thick with coal dust, and that ever-present whiff of decay. You're craving a bath, anything to scrub off the city's filth. But here's the kicker, finding a place to get clean is like hunting for a unicorn. Public bathhouses exist, but they're rare expensive, and not exactly the spa day you're dreaming of. You're about to learn just how elusive a proper wash was in this era, and trust me, it's a slog. You wander toward a busier street, hoping to find one of these fabled bathhouses. The crowd's a mix of workers, hawkers, and kids darting underfoot, all looking like they haven't seen soap in weeks. You spot a faded sign, public baths and washhouses. Your heart lifts, but don't get too excited. These places are few and far between, and they're not exactly welcoming. By the 1840s, the Bath and Washhouses Act encouraged cities to build them, but progress is slow. London has maybe a dozen for a population of millions. You do the math, that's a lot of dirty bodies, and not nearly enough tubs. You step inside, and the air's damp, heavy with the smell of mildew and cheap soap. The bathhouse is a cavernous room with stone floors slick with water and grime. A surly attendant demands a shilling, half a day's wages for a laborer. You wince, but hand it over, because the alternative is staying as you are, and that's not an option. The attendant points you to a row of wooden tubs, each barely big enough to sit in. The water's lukewarm, tinged gray, and you realize it's been used by who knows how many others. You hesitate, but the itch on your skin wins out. You climb in, trying not to think about what's floating around you. Here's a mainstream fact. Public bathhouses were a game changer for the few who could afford them. By the 1850s, places like the Goulston Square Baths in London's East End offered hot baths and laundry facilities serving thousands weekly. They were a step toward better hygiene, especially for the working class, who couldn't dream of private bathrooms. But thousands is a drop in the bucket when millions are crammed into slums. You're lucky to be here, But most folks you passed outside will never set foot in a place like this. They're stuck splashing their faces with whatever water they can scrounge, usually from a contaminated pump. Now for the quirky bit. Some bathhouses doubled as social clubs, but not the wholesome kind. Shady characters use them as fronts for gambling or worse, and rumors swirled about immoral behavior in the steam rooms. You glance around, half expecting a sketchy deal to go down in the corner, but it's just tired workers scrubbing in silence. Still, the vibe's off, and you're not lingering longer than necessary. Historians still argue whether these bathhouses improved public health or just gave people a false sense of cleanliness, since the water was often dirty and diseases spread anyway. The tub's cramped and the water's cooling fast. You grab a rough bar of soap, more on that luxury later, and start scrubbing. The soap's gritty like it's mixed with sand, and it barely lathers. You're working up a sweat just trying to get clean, which feels like a cruel irony. The guy in the next tub's muttering about the price, and you can't blame him. For the poor, bathing here means skipping a meal. You notice the walls are streaked with mold, and the ceiling drips. This place is cleaner than the streets, but that's a low bar. You're starting to see why most people skip bathing altogether. Let's talk about the alternatives, because they're grim. If you can't afford a bathhouse, you're washing at home if you can call it that. Most homes, especially in tenements, have no running water. You'd haul buckets from a communal pump, often the same one tainted by those overflowing privies you saw earlier. Then you'd heat the water over a fire, assuming you could afford fuel. The whole process takes hours, and you're sharing the water with your entire family. First one in gets the cleanest bath. Last one's basically stewing in soup. You're suddenly grateful for this dingy bathhouse, even if it's no five-star resort. The sensory details hit hard. The water's got a faint metallic tang, probably from rusty pipes, and your skin feels raw from the soap. The room echoes with coughs and the splash of water, and somewhere a pipe's leaking, adding a steady drip-drip to the chaos. Oh, here's a Victorian joke to lighten the mood they called a bathhouse visit. Taking the plunge, because it costs so much, you might as well jump into debt. You chuckle, but the guy next to you glares like you've lost it. You're starting to feel the weight of this era's hygiene struggles. Bathing's not just about getting clean, it's a class divide. The wealthy have private tub servants to heat the water, maybe even a fancy copper bath. You, though, you're slumming it with the masses, and it's humbling. You notice a woman across the room, her hands chapped from laundry work, scrubbing her arms like she's trying to erase the day. She's probably here because her job demands a certain respectability, but the effort's costing her dearly. Let's zoom out. Bathhouses were a rarity not just in London, but across Britain. Smaller towns might have one if they were lucky, but rural areas, forget it. You'd be washing in a stream, hoping it's not downstream from a village's waste. The lack of access shaped how people saw cleanliness. For many, being clean meant a quick wipe with a damp cloth, not a full soak. You're starting to understand why that dandy you saw earlier had a dingy collar. Even the effort to look clean was a battle. Here's another odd tidbit. Some Victorians thought too much. Bathing weakened you. Like dunking in water, could sap your vitality or make you catch a chill. You're tempted to roll your eyes, but when you're surrounded by cold, questionable water, maybe they had a point. You're shivering now the tub's gone frigid and you're ready to get out. You climb out dripping and grab a towel that's more holes than fabric. Your skin's cleaner, But you don't feel refreshed, just relieved to be done. As you dress, you notice the bathhouse's other side, the wash house. Women are bent over steaming vats, scrubbing clothes with the same gritty soap you used. The air's thick with steam, and their faces are flushed from the heat. You realize bathing's only half the hygiene puzzle. Clean clothes are just as rare and just as costly. You're starting to see the pattern. Every step toward cleanliness is a fight against time money and a world that's stacked against you. You step back into the street, the air hitting you like a wall of soot and stench. Your bath's already a memory, the city's grime creeping back onto your skin. You're cleaner than most, but that's not saying much. The bathhouse was a brief escape, but it's no solution. You're still in a world where hygiene's a luxury, and you're far from the elite who can afford it. You keep walking, the weight of the city pressing down, wondering how anyone survived this daily grind. You're back on the gritty streets of Victorian London, the memory of that lukewarm bathhouse tub already fading under a fresh layer of coal dust and city stink. You're cleaner than most, but that's a low bar, and you're starting to realize just how much effort it takes to stay even remotely presentable. Your skin's still damp from the bath, but your clothes stiff with days of wear are a reminder that hygiene's more than just a quick scrub. You're craving something to make you feel truly clean, and that brings you to soap, the unsung hero of hygiene. Except in this era, soap's not a hero. It's a luxury out of reach for most. You're about to dive into the world of Victorian soap, where even a basic bar is a status symbol. You duck into a market, the air buzzing with hawkers shouting about their wares. Stalls are piled with wilted vegetables, questionable meat, and the occasional trinket. But you're on a mission. You spot a chemist's shop, its window displaying a few precious bars of soap wrapped in paper, like they're fine jewelry. You step inside, and the air shifts from street stench to a faint whiff of lavender and carbolic acid. The shopkeeper, a wiry man with a waxed mustache. Eyes you like, you might steal his stock. You ask about soap, and he gestures to a shelf with a smirk. The prices are obscene, 6pence for a small bar, enough to buy a week's worth of bread for a poor family. You're starting to see why most folks skip it. Soap in the Victorian era wasn't the mass-produced stuff you grab at the supermarket. It was handmade, often from animal fat, and a process that took days and drove up costs. By the 1830s, industrial advances made soap slightly more common, but it was still taxed heavily until 1853, when the soap duty was repealed. That's your mainstream fact. The soap tax, which could double the price, kept clean hands a privilege for the wealthy. Even after the tax was lifted, soap remained a splurge for the working class, who might share a single bar among a dozen people. You pick up a bar, its surface rough and speckled with impurities, and wonder how it's supposed to make you feel fresh. Here's the quirky tidbit: some soaps were outright scams. Shady manufacturers cut corners, mixing in clay or sand to bulk up the bars, which barely lathered and left your skin feeling like you'd rolled in grit. You sniff the bar in your hand, lavender supposedly, but it's got an undertone of something sour, like it was made in a hurry. The shopkeeper swears it's the finest quality, but you're not convinced. Historians still argue whether these dodgy soaps did more harm than good, sometimes causing rashes or infections instead of cleaning. You decide to risk it, handing over your coins with a pang of regret. Cleanliness comes at a price, and you're paying it. You step back into the market, clutching your precious soap like it's gold. The crowd jostles you, and you notice how few people look like they've seen a bar like this recently. A woman selling apples has hands caked with dirt, her nails black with grime. A kid tugging at her skirt is no cleaner, his face streaked with soot. You're starting to feel like a snob, but it's hard not to when you're holding something most of them can't afford. Soap's not just about hygiene, it's a class marker. The wealthy flaunt their scented bars made with olive oil or exotic perfumes, while the poor make do with whatever scraps they can scrounge, if anything. Let's talk about what washing looks like without soap. You're picturing a sink and a nice foamy lather, but that's a fantasy. Most folks splash their faces with water from a bucket, maybe rubbing their hands with a rag that's seen better days. Without soap, you're not cleaning. You're just rearranging the dirt. You try it yourself, dipping your hands in a barrel of water outside a stall. The water's cloudy, and your hands come out feeling slick, not clean. You're tempted to use your new soap right there, but you'd probably start a riot. Soap's so rare that people might mob you for a sliver. The sensory details are relentless. The market's a cacophony of shouts, clinking coins, and the squawk of caged chickens. Your soap's tucked in your pocket, its faint lavender scent battling the street's mix of sweat and rotting produce. Your clothes are itching again, the fabric heavy with dust and damp. Oh, here's a Victorian joke for you. They called cheap soap washerwoman's tears because it stung your skin and made you cry. You're not laughing, though the thought of scrubbing with this bar is already making you wince. You keep moving, weaving through the crowd. You pass a fancy carriage, its occupant hidden behind velvet curtains. You bet they've got a whole collection of soaps, rose jasmine, maybe even imported from France. For them, soap's not just functional, it's a performance of wealth. You're jealous, but you're also practical. Your bar's not fancy, but it's yours, and you're determined to make it last. You calculate in your head, one bar used sparingly might get you through a month. If you're lucky. Let's zoom out. Soap's scarcity shaped Victorian hygiene in ways you're only starting to grasp. Without it, diseases like typhus and cholera spread by unwashed hands, and bodies ran rampant. Public health reports from the 1840s show that slum dwellers often went weeks without washing, not out of laziness, but necessity. Water was scarce, soap was scarcer, and survival trumped cleanliness. You're starting to see why those bathhouses you visited were such a big deal, even if they were grimy. They at least gave you a shot at using soap, assuming you could afford both. Here's another oddity. Some Victorians thought soap was dangerous. Not the fake stuff, but the real deal. Medical advice from the era warned that too much washing could strip the skin's natural oils or make you prone to colds. You're tempted to scoff, but when you're shivering in a damp tenement with no heat, maybe skipping a wash sounds reasonable. You're not buying it, though. Your modern brain's screaming for a proper shower, and this bar's your only hope. You stop by a pump where a crowd's filling buckets. You're tempted to test your soap, but the water's so murky it looks like tea. You decide to wait until you're somewhere private, if such a place exists in this overcrowded city. You notice a group of women nearby their aprons, stained, gossiping about a neighbor who wastes money on soap like she's a lady. The judgment's sharp, and you realize cleanliness isn't just about health, it's social currency. Use too little, and you're a slob. Use too much, and you're putting on airs. As you walk on, the market fades behind you, but the soap's weight in your pocket is a constant reminder. You're one of the lucky ones, but even you can't escape the city's grime entirely. You pass a factory, its chimney belching black smoke that settles on your skin like a second layer. Your soap's a small victory, but it's not enough. You're starting to understand the exhaustion of this era's hygiene fight. Every step toward cleanliness is a battle against cost access and a culture that doesn't always value it. You're itching to get home wherever that is and try your soap. The thought of lather, even gritty lather, is a lifeline. But the streets are still crowded, the air still thick, and your clothes are still filthy. You're cleaner than you were, thanks to that bathhouse, but without soap, as a regular habit, you're fighting a losing war. You keep walking the soap, a promise of better days, even if those days feel impossibly far off. You're still weaving through the crowded streets of Victorian London, your precious bar of soap tucked safely in your pocket, its faint lavender scent, a small rebellion against the city's relentless stench. The market's chaos fades behind you, but the grime's a constant companion. Coal dust in the air, muck on your boots, and that lingering memory of sewage from those overflowing alleys. You're cleaner than most, thanks to that rare bathhouse visit. But now you're facing a new challenge, the daily reality of waste disposal in a city with no proper plumbing. You're about to discover the grim world of chamber pots, where even the most private act is a messy, smelly ordeal. You find yourself outside a cramped tenement, its walls blackened with soot and damp with mold. You step inside, squeezing past a family huddled around a single candle. The air's thick, a mix of sweat, stale food, and something sharper, human waste. In a corner, you spotted a chipped ceramic chamber pot, half hidden under a rickety bed. This is the Victorian bathroom, and it's as unglamorous as it gets. Most homes, especially in slums, rely on these pots for nighttime needs, since trudging to an outhouse in the dark is a gamble with thieves or worse. You're staring at the pot, and the thought of using it makes your skin crawl. Here's the mainstream fact: chamber pots were universal in Victorian households, from shabby tenements to posh manors. By the 1840s, they were made of ceramic or metal, sometimes with a lid if you were fancy, and emptied daily ideally. In poorer homes, one pot might serve a dozen people, and emptying often meant dumping it into the street or a nearby cesspit. You're starting to understand why those sewage-flooded alleys you dodged earlier were so common. The pot in front of you is full, its contents reeking, and you realize someone's got to deal with it. Spoiler that someone's probably you. You grab the pot, holding it at arm's length, and head for the door. The tenement's courtyard is a maze of laundry lines and kids playing in the dirt. You spot a communal cesspit, a shallow hole in the ground, already brimming with waste. Flies swarm, and the smell hits you like a punch. You tip the pot's contents in trying not to splash yourself and hurry back inside. This is daily life every morning. Millions of chamber pots are emptied, adding to the city's sanitation nightmare. You're gagging, and honestly, who can blame you? Here's a Victorian joke to lighten the mood they called chamber pots, thunder mugs because of the noise they made when you missed in the dark. You're not laughing, though the reality's too grim. Now for the quirky tidbit. Some folks got creative with their pots. The wealthy had ornate versions painted with flowers or monograms, like waste was somehow classier in a pretty container. You're in a slum, so your pot's plain cracked and definitely not winning any design awards. But you can't help wondering about those fancy ones. Did a duchess really feel better squatting over a rose-painted pot? Historians still argue whether these decorated pots were a genuine status symbol or just a bizarre way to cope with the era's sanitation woes. Either way, you're stuck with the budget model, and it's not doing you any favors. The sensory assault's relentless. The tenement's air is damp, the pot's stench lingering even after you've emptied it. Your hands feel grimy, and you're desperate to wash them, but water's scarce, and your soap's too precious to use on a whim. The floor creaks underfoot, littered with crumbs and mystery stains. Outside, the courtyard hums with noise, kids shouting, a dog barking, and the slosh of someone else emptying their pot. You're starting to feel trapped, like the filth's closing in from every angle. This isn't just about hygiene, it's about survival in a world where even the basics are a struggle. Let's talk about the bigger picture. Chamber pots were a symptom of a city buckling under its own growth, with no widespread plumbing waste piled up faster than anyone could handle. Cesspits like the one you just visited often overflowed, leaking into wells and rivers. You remember that cloudy water from the market pump? Yeah, this is why. Public health reports from the 1850s estimate that a single cesspit could serve up to 100 people with no regular cleaning. Diseases like dysentery and typhoid thrived in these conditions, and you're starting to see why life expectancy in slums was so low. You're back inside now, the empty pot returned to its corner. The family's watching you, their faces weary. You notice a woman scrubbing a pot with a rag, her hands red and raw. She's trying to keep it clean, but without soap or hot water, it's a losing battle. You're tempted to offer your soap, but you know it's a luxury you can't share lightly. The guilt stings, but survival's a harsh teacher. You're learning fast that hygiene here isn't about feeling good, it's about minimizing the damage. Here's another oddity. Some Victorians believed chamber pots could predict the future. Fortune tellers would read the contents, claiming the patterns revealed your fate. You're not sure whether to laugh or cry at the thought of someone peering into this pot for divine insight. You're definitely not signing up for that, but it's a reminder of how desperate people were for hope, even in the grossest places. You're sticking to your soap and your wits, thank you very much. You step outside again, needing air, but the courtyard's no relief. The cesspit stench follows you, and the ground's slick with who knows what. You spot a night soil man like the one you saw earlier shoveling waste from another pit. His face is set like he's shut off his senses to survive the job. You give him a nod, a small acknowledgement of his grim work, but he doesn't notice. You're starting to see the invisible army of people keeping this city from drowning in its own filth, and it's humbling. Let's zoom out. Chamber pots weren't just a London problem, they were everywhere in Victorian Britain. Rural villages might use a stream or a field, but cities had no such escape. The lack of sanitation shaped daily life, from the morning ritual of emptying pots to the constant fear of disease. You're starting to understand why those public bathhouses, flawed as they were, felt like a lifeline. They offered a break from this cycle of waste, even if just for an hour. You're itching to move on, but the tenement's a reminder of how trapped people were. The family inside will repeat this routine tomorrow, and the next day, and the next. You're lucky you've got your soap, your bathhouse memory, and the freedom to keep walking. But for them, this is home, and the chamber pot's just one of many battles. You take a deep breath, regretting it instantly, and head back to the street. The city's waiting, and it's not getting any cleaner. As you walk, you notice the weight of your soap in your pocket. It's a small comfort, but it's not enough to erase the reality of this place. You're starting to feel the exhaustion of Victorian hygiene, not just the physical toll, but the mental one. Every choice from washing your hands to emptying a pot is a calculation of cost, risk, and survival. You keep moving the tenement fading behind you, but the smell of that chamber pot lingers, a grim reminder of a world where even the basics are a fight. You're back on the move through Victorian London's grimy streets, the weight of that soap in your pocket, a faint comfort against the city's relentless filth. The memory of that chamber pot stench still haunts you, mingling with the coal dust and sour air. You're starting to feel the grit on your face, but there's another hygiene hurdle looming, one that hits closer to home. Your mouth feels like a battlefield, gritty and stale, and you realize dental care in this era is a whole different beast. You're about to dive into the world of Victorian tooth powders, where fresh breath is more hope than reality, and the solutions are as dubious as they sound. You duck into a narrow street lined with shops, the cobblestones slick from a recent drizzle, or maybe something worse. You spot an apothecary, its window cluttered with bottles and jars promising cures for everything from gout to bad luck. Inside, the air's sharp with the tang of herbs and chemicals. You ask the apothecary, a wiry woman with a skeptical squint, for something to clean your teeth. She slides a small tin across the counter labeled Dr. Pritchard's tooth powder. It's pricey, 3p enough for a day's bread, but you're desperate. You open the tin and a puff of chalky dust hits your nose, smelling vaguely of mint and something metallic. This is your toothbrush Victorian style. Here's the mainstream fact: tooth powders were the go-to for dental hygiene in the 19th century, used by anyone who could afford them. Made from ingredients like chalk, charcoal, or even ground cuttlefish bone, they were rubbed onto teeth with a finger or a rudimentary brush. By the 1840s, commercial brands like Dr. Pritchard's were popping up, marketed as miracles for pearly whites. But they were abrasive, often damaging enamel, and did little to fight decay. You dip a finger into the powder and rub it on your teeth, wincing at the gritty texture. It's like chewing sand, and your gums are already protesting. Now for the quirky tidbit: some tooth powders were downright bizarre. Recipes from the era included ingredients like crushed coral burnt bread, or get this, powdered ox hoof. You're lucky your tin's just chalk and a hint of peppermint, but you can't shake the thought of someone grinding up hooves for their morning routine. Historians still argue whether these odd additives were based on genuine folk remedies or just desperate attempts to make tooth powders seem exotic. Either way, you're not thrilled, but you keep rubbing, hoping for a miracle. The apothecary watches you amused as you grimace through the process. Your mouth feels raw, and the powder's left a chalky film that no amount of rinsing will fix. You're stuck with the communal water jug in the corner, its contents suspiciously cloudy, probably from the same tainted pumps you've been dodging. You swish and spit, trying not to think about what you're swallowing. Dental care here isn't about health, it's about appearances, especially for the middle and upper classes, who flash their slightly less yellow teeth as a status symbol. You're not feeling particularly glamorous, though your gums are tingling, and not in a good way. Let's talk about the alternatives, because they're grim. If you can't afford tooth powder, you're chewing on a twig or wiping your teeth with a rag, maybe dipped in salt if you're lucky. The poor often went without, and you've seen the results in the market-blackened stumps, where teeth should be even in people barely out of their teens. Tooth decay was rampant, fueled by sugary diets, and no real understanding of oral hygiene. You're starting to appreciate your tin, even if it's more punishment than pleasure. The sensory details hit hard. The apothecary's shop is dim, lit by a flickering lamp that casts shadows on shelves of murky bottles. The tooth powder's gritty crunch echoes in your skull, and your mouth tastes like a mix of mint and regret. Outside, the street hums with noise, cartwheels creaking, a hawker shouting about oysters, and the distant clang of a factory bell. Your clothes are heavy with damp and dust, and you're itching to wash your face, but that's a problem for later. Here's a Victorian joke to keep you going. They called bad tooth powder gravel paste because it felt like you were brushing with a driveway. You're not laughing, but you get the point. You step back into the street, the tin tucked in your pocket next to your soap. The crowd jostles you, and you notice a man with a gap-toothed grin selling pies. You're tempted, but the thought of chewing with your freshly cleaned teeth makes you hesitate. Dental problems were a constant worry, and extractions done by barbers or quack dentists with no anesthesia were more common than prevention. You've heard horror stories of pliers and screams, and you're determined to keep your teeth even if it means choking down this powder daily. Let's zoom out. Poor dental hygiene wasn't just a personal issue, it was a public health crisis. Periodontal disease and infections contributed to the era's high mortality rates, especially in slums, where malnutrition made things worse. Public health reports from the 1850s describe children with rotting teeth by age 5 and adults losing theirs by 30. You're starting to see why that bathhouse and soap felt like luxuries. Hygiene in any form was a fight against a world that seemed designed to make you sick. Here's another oddity. Some Victorians thought bad teeth were a sign of moral failing, like laziness or gluttony. You're tempted to roll your eyes, but when you're surrounded by people judging every inch of your appearance, it's not hard to see why they'd cling to such ideas. You're self-conscious now, running your tongue over your teeth, hoping they pass muster. The powder's done something, but sparkling isn't the word you'd use. You're fighting a losing battle, and you know it. You keep walking the street, opening into a busier thoroughfare. You pass a fancy chemist's shop, its window boasting French tooth elixir for $1 a bottle. You're jealous of whoever can afford that, but your budget tin's all you've got. You notice a woman nearby, her face powdered to hide blemishes, but her teeth are yellowed and uneven. She's trying to look respectable, but the effort's costing her. You're starting to see the pattern. Hygiene here is a performance, and everyone's playing a role, whether they can afford the props or not. As you move on, the city's grime settles back onto you. Your mouth's still chalky, and you're craving a proper toothbrush, something that won't exist for decades. You pass a group of kids playing in the gutter, their faces smudged with dirt. You wonder if they've ever heard of tooth powder, let alone used it. The thought's sobering, and you clutch your tin a little tighter. It's not much, but it's a lifeline in a world where even clean teeth are a luxury. You're starting to feel the weight of this era's hygiene struggles. Every step, whether it's bathing, buying soap, or brushing your teeth, is a reminder of how much you're fighting against. The city's a machine, grinding down anyone who can't keep up, and hygiene's just one more gear in the mess. You keep walking, the apothecary fading behind you, but the chalky taste lingers, a gritty reminder of a time when even the basics were a battle. You're still trudging through the smoky haze of Victorian London, your soap and tooth powder tucked in your pocket, like talismans against the city's unrelenting grime. The chalky aftertaste of that tooth powder lingers, a reminder of how even basic hygiene feels like a battle. Now your scalp's starting to itch, and your hair feels heavy, greasy from days, maybe weeks of neglect. Washing your hair in this era is no simple task. It's a rare, dreaded ritual that's more ordeal than self-care. You're about to discover just how Victorians dealt with their locks. And spoiler, it's not a shampoo commercial. You slip into a quieter street, the clamor of the market fading, though the air's still thick with coal dust and the faint whiff of sewage. You're headed to a tenement where you've got a corner to call your own, hoping to tackle your hair. Inside, the air's damp, smelling of mold and yesterday's stew. Your bathroom is a battered tin basin on a wobbly table filled with water you hauled from a pump down the street. It's cold, cloudy, and barely enough to wet your hair, let alone clean it. You sigh, knowing this is going to be a slog. Here's the mainstream fact. Hair washing in the Victorian era was infrequent, often monthly, or less even for the wealthy. Water was scarce, heating. It was costly, and the process was so time-consuming that most people just didn't bother. Instead, they brushed their hair. Daily 100 strokes was the rule to spread natural oils and keep it tidy. You grab a boar bristle brush and start wincing as it snags on knots. The brushing helps, but your scalp's still greasy, and the dust from London streets has settled into your roots like a bad guest. You dip your hands into the basin, splashing water onto your hair. It's freezing, and your fingers go numb as you work the water through, trying to loosen the grime. Soap, like that precious bar in your pocket, was rarely used on hair. It was too harsh and expensive. Instead, you've got a homemade concoction, a mix of vinegar and rosemary water, recommended by a neighbor who swore it refreshes. You pour it over your head, and the sharp, sour smell makes your eyes water. It's not exactly a spa day, and your hair feels more slimy than clean. You're starting to understand why those elaborate Victorian hairstyles were more about hiding dirt than showing off. Now for the quirky tidbit. Some Victorians used egg yolks as shampoo. Yes, raw eggs cracked open and rubbed into the scalp, supposedly to nourish and shine. You're glad you stuck with vinegar, but you can't help imagining the mess and the smell of egg drying in your hair on a hot day. Historians still argue whether these egg washes were a genuine beauty hack or just a desperate substitute for proper cleaning products. Either way, you're not cracking any eggs today. Your stomach's already churning from the vinegar fumes. The sensory assault's relentless. The tenement's walls are streaked with damp, and the air's heavy like breathing through a wet rag. Your hair drips, soaking your collar, and the cold water's given you goosebumps. The basin's water is now a murky gray, flecked with dirt and who knows what from your scalp. You hear the creak of floorboards as neighbors move about their own lives, a hum of noise, kids whining a kettle, whistling, someone coughing. Here's a Victorian joke to cut the gloom they called unwashed hair a bird's nest, because it could probably house a sparrow or two. You're not laughing, but you check your hair for stray twigs just in case. You keep at it, rinsing with the last of the water, but your hair's still heavy, clinging to your scalp, like it's given up. Drying's another hassle. No towels, just a scrap of cloth that's seen better days. You pat your hair, trying not to think about how long it'll take to air dry in this damp room. For women, long hair was a point of pride, often never cut, which made washing even harder. You're starting to envy the men with their shorter cuts, though you've seen plenty with hair just as greasy, slicked back with pomade to mask the filth. Let's talk about the alternatives, because they're not great. If you can't wash, you're dusting your hair with powders, talc or starch, to soak up grease. It's like dry shampoo's great-grandparent, but it leaves your scalp itchy and your hair looking like you've been caught in a flower explosion. You've seen women in the market with powdery white streaks in their hair, trying to look refined, but mostly looking desperate. The wealthy might use imported pomades or oils scented with jasmine or bergamot, but that's a fantasy for you. Your vinegar rinse is as fancy as it gets, and it's barely doing the job. Let's zoom out. Hair washing's rarity wasn't just a personal choice. It was a symptom of the era's hygiene crisis. Without running water or affordable products, keeping clean was a luxury, and hair was low on the priority list. Public health reports from the 1850s note that scalp infections and lice were rampant, especially in overcrowded slums, where entire families shared beds. You're starting to see why that bathhouse felt like a miracle, even with its grimy tubs. It offered a chance to wash more than just your face, but for most, it was a pipe dream. Here's another oddity. Some Victorians believed frequent hair washing caused baldness. Medical journals of the time warned that water weakened the follicles, and men especially were told to avoid it to keep their hairline. You're tempted to scoff, but when you're shivering with wet hair in a drafty tenement, maybe they had a point. You're not buying it, though. Your scalp's screaming for relief, and you'd risk a few strands for a proper clean. You're finally done. Your hair damp and slightly less greasy, but clean as a stretch. You brush it again, hoping to coax some life back into it, but it's a losing battle. You notice a neighbor watching her own hair pinned up in a greasy bun. She mutters about fancy folk who wash too often, and you realize hygiene's a social minefield. Wash too little, and you're a slob. Wash too much, and you're vain. You're just trying to survive, but the judgment's everywhere. As you step back outside, the city's grime hits you like a wave. Your hair's already collecting dust, undoing your hard work. You pass a barber's shop, its window promising haircuts and tonics, but you've heard enough about their dirty razors to steer clear. You notice a group of kids nearby, their hair matted and crawling with lice. The sight's sobering, and you're grateful for your vinegar rinse, flawed as it was. Hygiene here is a constant trade-off: time, money, and effort for results that never last. You keep walking, the tenement fading behind you. Your scalp's still tingling, and your hair's a damp mess, but you're one step ahead of the city's filth. You're starting to feel the weight of this era's hygiene, struggles every task, from brushing your teeth to washing your hair, is a reminder of how little control you have. The city's a relentless machine, and you're just trying to keep up one gritty victory at a time. You're still navigating the grimy maze of Victorian London, your damp hair clinging to your scalp, the faint vinegar tang, a reminder of your recent washing attempt. The soap and tooth powder in your pocket feel like hard-won treasures, but the city's filth is relentless. Coal dust in the air, muck underfoot, and that ever-present whiff of sewage. Your scalp's itching again, but this time it's not just grease. You feel a tiny prick, then another, and your heart sinks. Lice. In this overcrowded, unwashed world, they're as common as cobblestones, and you're about to face the relentless battle against these tiny invaders in cramped, filthy homes. You hurry back to your tenement, squeezing through a narrow alley where the air's thick with the smell of rotting food and human waste. Inside the dim room's a familiar mess: damp walls, a creaking floor, and the lingering stench of that chamber pot you emptied earlier. You share this space with a family of 6, all packed into one room, sleeping on straw mattresses that haven't been cleaned in months. You scratch your scalp, and the itching intensifies. Lice thrive in places like this, where bodies are close, hygiene's a luxury, and clean bedding's a fantasy. You're not alone. Everyone's scratching from the kids to the grandmother in the corner. Here's the mainstream fact: lice infestations were a widespread problem in Victorian Britain, especially in urban slums. By the 1850s, public health reports estimated that up to 90% of poor children in cities like London had head lice spread through shared beds, combs, and clothing. They weren't just a nuisance. Lice carried diseases like typhus, which could wipe out entire families. You grab a fine-toothed comb, a cheap metal one you bought at the market, and start raking it through your hair. It snags, pulling strands, and you wince as you spot tiny gray bugs caught in the teeth. This is going to be a long night. You sit by a flickering candle, the only light in the room, and keep combing. The process is slow, and your arms ache, but stopping's not an option. The family's watching their own scalps, probably crawling. But combs are scarce, and you're not sharing. You dip the comb in a cup of vinegar left over from your hair washing fiasco, hoping it'll kill the lice. It stings your scalp, but you're desperate. The kids are giggling at your grim expression, and you force a smile. Here's a Victorian joke to ease the tension they called lice-active citizens, because they never stopped moving. You're not amused, but you keep combing, determined to evict these unwelcome guests. Now for the quirky tidbit. Some Victorians swore by bizarre lice remedies, like rubbing mercury ointment on their scalps. Yes, mercury, the toxic metal that could kill you faster than the lice. You're sticking with vinegar, but you can't help wondering about the poor souls who tried that one. Historians still argue whether these dangerous treatments were driven by ignorance or desperation, given how little was known about safe pest control. Either way, you're grateful for your comb, even if it's tearing your hair out along with the lice. The sensory details are overwhelming. The tenement's air is heavy, a mix of sweat mold and the sour bite of vinegar. Your scalp's raw from scratching, and the comb's teeth scrape like tiny knives. The straw mattress beneath you rustles, probably hiding more lice, and you shudder at the thought. Outside, the street's alive with noise, drunken shouts, a cart rattling, and the distant wail of a baby. Your hands are sticky with vinegar, and the candle's heat is making you sweat, adding to the grime you're trying to fight. You're starting to feel like the city's winning, and you're just a speck in its filthy machine. Let's talk about the alternatives, because they're not much better. If you can't afford a comb or vinegar, you're picking lice out by hand, a tedious job that's never done. Some folks shave their heads, especially men, to avoid the problem altogether. But that's a bold move when appearances matter. You've seen women in the market with tightly pinned buns, hiding lice under layers of grease and pins. The wealthy might use imported powders or oils, but those are as rare as gold in this tenement. You're stuck with what you've got, and it's barely enough. Let's zoom out. Lice weren't just a personal problem, they were a public health crisis. Overcrowding, poor sanitation, and shared living spaces made infestations inevitable. Schools, workhouses, and factories were breeding grounds with lice spreading faster than gossip. Public health campaigns in the 1860s tried to promote regular washing and combing, but without access to clean water or tools, it was a pipe dream for most. You're starting to see why that bathhouse and soap felt like miracles. They offered a fleeting chance to break this cycle, but for most, it was a distant dream. Here's another oddity. Some Victorians thought lice were a sign of vitality, like a healthy body attracted them the way flowers draw bees. You're tempted to roll your eyes, but when you're surrounded by people who've normalized scratching, maybe it's easier to lean into the myth. You're not buying it. Every tug of the comb feels like a personal vendetta against these bugs. You're determined to win, even if it means a sleepless night and a sore scalp. You keep combing the pile of dead lice growing on the table. The grandmother offers a tip sleep with a cloth soaked in gin on your head. You're not sure if she's joking, but gin's too pricey to waste on your hair, and you're not that desperate yet. You notice the kids have stopped giggling and started scratching their mother, sighing as she inspects their heads. Lice don't discriminate, and in this tenement, everyone's a target. You're starting to feel the weight of this shared struggle, where even the smallest victory feels like a miracle. As you work, you think about the city outside. Those fancy folks in their carriages probably deal with lice too, but they've got maids to comb their hair and clean sheets to sleep in. You're stuck with a straw mattress and a comb that's seen better days. You pass the comb to the mother, a small act of kindness, and she nods gratefully. Community's all you've got in a place like this, where survival's a team effort, even if it's a grim one. You're finally done, your scalp tender, but less itchy. You shake out your hair, hoping you've caught most of the lice, but you know they'll be back. The tenement's a breeding ground, and you're fighting a war you can't win. You step outside for air, but the street's no cleaner, damp, smoky, and buzzing with flies. You spot a group of factory workers, their hair matted under caps, probably crawling with lice too. The sight's sobering, and you're grateful for your comb, even if it's a small weapon in a big fight. You keep walking, the tenement fading behind you. Your scalp's still tingling, and you're hyper-aware of every itch. You're starting to feel the exhaustion of Victorian hygiene. Every task, from washing your hair to fighting lice, is a reminder of how little you control. The city's a relentless beast, and you're just trying to carve out a sliver of cleanliness in its shadow. Your soap, your tooth powder, your comb, they're all you've got, and they're not enough. But you keep going one scratchy step at a time. You're still trudging through the gritty streets of Victorian London, your scalp tender from that lice-combing marathon, the faint sting of vinegar lingering in your hair. Your soap and tooth powder are safe in your pocket. Small victories against the city's relentless filth, coal dust, sewage, and the sour tang of unwashed bodies. But the battle's far from over. You're approaching a slum where the air grows thicker, the ground stickier, and the smell unbearable. This is where cesspits lurk hidden beneath tenement yards, silently breeding disease. You're about to confront the grim reality of these waste pits, where every breath is a reminder of the city's deadly underbelly. You weave through a maze of alleys, the tenements leaning closer, their walls streaked with mold. The street narrows, and you spot a courtyard shared by a dozen families. In the center, barely covered by a rotting wooden board, is a cesspit, a shallow, stinking hole overflowing with human waste. The smell hits you like a wall, a mix of decay and ammonia that burns your throat. Flies buzz in a frantic cloud, and you pull your collar over your nose, though it does little to help. This is where chamber pots, like the one you emptied, end up, and it's a breeding ground for more than just bad odors. Here's the mainstream fact. Cesspits were a primary waste disposal method in Victorian cities until the 1860s, especially in slums. Built under homes or in shared yards, they were meant to hold sewage until night soil men cleared them, but most were neglected, leaking into soil and water supplies. By the 1850s, reports estimated that a single cesspit could serve 100 people with no regular maintenance. You're staring at one now, its contents seeping into the dirt, and you realize why those pumps you've been avoiding are so dangerous. This pit's not just a nuisance, it's a death trap. You step closer, holding your breath, and peer into the muck. The pit's edges are crumbling, and the ground around it's slick with overflow. You spot a kid nearby, barefoot, playing dangerously close to the edge. Your modern brain's screaming about bacteria, but no one here knows about germs yet. They blame the miasma, that bad air you've heard about for the fevers and sickness sweeping the slums. You want to shout a warning, but you'd be met with blank stares. Instead, you back away, your boots squelching in the damp earth, and pray you don't carry this stench with you all day. Now for the quirky tidbit, some cesspits were so full they'd talk. Locals swore they heard gurgling or popping sounds as gases escaped, giving pits nicknames like Old Grumbler. You strain your ears, half expecting a burp from the pit, but all you get is the drone of flies. Historians still argue whether these stories were superstitious folklore or just a way to cope with the grim reality of living atop a sewage bomb. Either way, you're not sticking around to find out if this pit's chatty. The sensory assault's relentless. The air's heavy, like breathing through a damp, rotten rag, and your eyes water from the ammonia. Your boots are caked with mud, or worse, and every step feels like a risk. The courtyard's alive with noise, kids shouting, a woman yelling at a dog, and the creak of a cart in the distance. Your clothes are heavy with damp, and the itch from those lice is creeping back, as if the city's reminding you who's boss. Here's a Victorian joke to cut the gloom they called cesspits Parliament pits, because they were full of hot air, and nobody wanted to deal with them. You're not laughing, but you appreciate the shade. Let's talk about the consequences. Cesspits didn't just stink, they spread disease. Cholera, typhoid, and dysentery thrived in these conditions, with contaminated water as the silent killer. In 1849, a cholera outbreak in London killed over 14,000 people, many in slums like this, where cesspits leaked into wells. You glance at a pump nearby where a woman's filling a bucket, and your stomach twists. She's got no idea what's in that water, but you do, and it's not just dirt. The tragedy's maddening, but germ theory's still a decade away, and you're powerless to change it. You keep moving, eager to escape the courtyard, but the stench follows like a shadow. You pass a night soil man, his cart piled high with waste, his face set in a grim mask. He's shoveling from another pit, and you give him a wide berth, remembering the back-breaking work you've seen before. These men are the city's unsung heroes, but they're also its victims, wading through disease daily for pennies. You're starting to see the human cost of this sanitation crisis, from the kids playing in filth to the workers cleaning it up. Let's zoom out. Cesspits were a symptom of a city stretched beyond its limits. The Industrial Revolution packed millions into urban centers, but infrastructure lagged behind. London's population doubled between 1800 and 1850, and cesspits meant for smaller towns couldn't cope. Wealthier areas might have early sewers, but slums relied on pits with devastating results. Public health reformers like Edwin Chadwick were starting to sound alarms, but change was slow, and you're stuck in the messy middle where every day's a gamble with disease. Here's another oddity: some landlords charged extra rent for homes with cesspits, marketing them as modern conveniences. You're tempted to scoff convenient for who exactly? But when the alternative's dumping waste in the street, maybe a pit seemed like a step up. You're not buying it, though this courtyard's a nightmare, and you'd trade that convenience for a proper sewer in a heartbeat. Your modern brain's screaming for sanitation, but you're stuck in a world where filth is just life. You're back in the alley now, the cesspit's stench fading, but not gone. You notice a woman scrubbing clothes in a bucket, her hands raw, the water gray with dirt. She's fighting the same battle you are trying to carve out cleanliness in a world that's against her. You want to offer your soap, but you know it's a luxury you can't spare. The guilt's familiar by now, but so's the instinct to survive. You're learning fast that hygiene here isn't about comfort. It's about dodging death one careful step at a time. As you walk, you pass a boarded-up tenement, its windows dark. You wonder if disease from a cesspit claimed the family inside, or if they just fled for cleaner air. The city's a graveyard for the unlucky, and you're hyper-aware of every breath, every touch. Your soap's a lifeline, but it's useless against the invisible killers in the water and air. You're starting to feel the weight of this era's hygiene crisis, not just the filth, but the fear that comes with it. You keep moving, the alley opening into a wider street, but the grime's still there, coating your skin, your clothes, your thoughts. You're one of the lucky ones. You've got soap, a comb, a bit of tooth powder, but even you can't escape the city's grip. The cesspit's a reminder of how fragile life is here, where a single drink of water or a step in the wrong puddle could end you. You're exhausted, but you keep going, clutching your small victories, knowing the next battle's just around the corner. You're still weaving through Victorian London's filthy streets, the cesspit's stench fading, but never quite gone, like a bad dream clinging to your senses. Your soap, tooth powder, and comb are small anchors in your pocket, but the city's grime, coal dust, sewage, and sweat keeps piling on. You're parched, your throat scratchy from the smoky air, and you're eyeing a pump on the corner. But you hesitate. Water in this era isn't just scarce, it's a gamble often laced with invisible dangers. You're about to confront the terrifying reality of Victorian water, where every sip could be your last. You approach the pump, its iron handle slick with use. A line of people, women with buckets, kids with jars, wait their turn, their faces weary but resigned. The water gushes out cloudy and flecked with bits of who knows what. You remember the cesspit you just left, its contents seeping into the ground, and your stomach churns. This pump's likely drawing from the same tainted earth, maybe even the Thames, that giant sewer you've been dodging. You're thirsty, but the thought of drinking this makes your skin crawl. Here's the mainstream fact: contaminated water was a leading cause of death in Victorian cities. By the 1840s, most urban water sources, rivers, wells, and pumps were polluted with sewage and industrial waste. The Thames alone received millions of gallons of raw sewage daily, yet it supplied much of London's drinking water. Cholera spread through fecal contaminated water, killed tens of thousands, with major outbreaks in 1831 and 1849. You're staring at the pump, knowing it's a roulette wheel, and you're not feeling lucky. You let a woman go ahead of you, buying time to decide. You watch her fill a bucket, the water splashing onto her apron, already stained with grime. She doesn't flinch, but you're hyper-aware of what's at stake. Your modern brain's screaming about bacteria, but here, people still believe in miasma, that bad air causes disease. You want to warn them, but you'd be laughed off or worse. Instead, you step back, your throat still dry, and scan for another option. A street vendor selling ale, but that's no safer brewed with the same dodgy water. You're starting to see why tea boiled and bitter is so popular. At least the heat kills something. Now for the quirky tidbit. Some Victorians thought cloudy water was healthier, believing the murk held vital minerals. You're tempted to gag, imagining what those minerals really are, probably traces of the cesspit you just fled. Historians still argue whether this belief was pure ignorance or a coping mechanism for a world with no clean options. Either way, you're not buying it. You'd trade your precious soap for a bottle of filtered water right now, but that's a fantasy decades away. The sensory assault's relentless. The air's thick with coal smoke stinging your eyes, and the pump's water smells faintly of rot, like a damp cellar gone wrong. Your boots are caked with street muck, and your clothes are heavy itching against your skin. The street's alive with noise, cartwheels creaking, a hawker shouting about fish, and the splash of water as buckets overflow. Your scalp's still tender from that lice combing, and you're hyper-aware of every itch, every gritty speck on your face. Here's a Victorian joke to lighten the mood they called bad water soup of the day, because you never knew what was in it. You're not laughing, your thirst's too real. Let's talk about the alternatives, because they're grim. If you skip the pump, you're scrounging rainwater, which is often black with soot, or buying from water carts, whose barrels are just as tainted. The wealthy have private wells, or pay for clean water, delivered in casks. But even that's no guarantee carts often refilled from the Thames. You're stuck with the pump, and you know it's a risk. You finally pump a small cup's worth, holding it up to the light. It's gray with tiny specks, floating like bad omens. You're tempted to pour it out, but thirst wins. You sip, grimacing at the metallic tang, and pray you don't regret it. Let's zoom out. Water contamination wasn't just a London problem, it plagued every industrial city in Victorian Britain. Manchester, Birmingham, Liverpool all struggled with polluted rivers and wells. Public health reports from the 1850s describe slums where entire families shared a single bucket of water for drinking, cooking, and washing, all drawn from sources like this pump. Diseases didn't discriminate, but the poor suffer most, with no means to escape the cycle. You're starting to see why that bathhouse flawed, as it was felt like a lifeline. It offered water that was at least warm, even if it wasn't clean. Here's another oddity. Some Victorians drank water from holy wells, believing their spiritual purity protected against disease. You've heard whispers of a well near a church blessed by a saint, but you're skeptical. Holy or not, it's probably downstream from a cesspit. You're sticking with your pump water, as bad as it is, because at least it's here. Your modern brain's screaming for a filter, but you're stuck in a world where clean water's a myth and every drink's a leap of faith. You keep moving the cup empty, but your throat's still scratchy. You pass a tenement where a woman's boiling water over a fire, her face flushed from the heat. She's one of the smart ones. Boiling might kill some germs, but it's a luxury requiring fuel most can't afford. You're jealous, but you're also practical. Your soap's no use here, and your tooth powder won't help if you're sick from bad water. You're starting to feel the weight of this era's hygiene crisis, not just the filth, but the constant fear of what's invisible. You notice a group of kids nearby splashing in a puddle that's definitely not rainwater. Their laughter's a stark contrast to the boarded-up houses around them, where cholera's left its mark. You want to pull them away, but you know it's futile. They're born into this, and puddles are their playground. The tragedy's heavy, and you're hyper-aware of the water you just drank, sitting like a stone in your stomach. You're one of the lucky ones. You've got your soap, your comb, but even you can't escape the city's grip. As you walk, you pass a market stall selling health tonics, their bottles filled with murky liquid that's probably worse than the pump water. The vendors shouting about cures, but you've seen enough quackery to steer clear. You're starting to understand the desperation that drives people to these scams. When every drink's a risk, you'll try anything for a chance at health. Your thirst's back, but you're not stopping at another pump, not yet. You're learning fast that hygiene here isn't about comfort, it's about survival. One cautious sip at a time. You keep moving the street opening into a busier thoroughfare, but the grime's still there, coating your skin, your thoughts. You're exhausted, not just from the physical toll, but from the mental strain of dodging danger at every turn. The city's a relentless beast, and you're just a speck clutching your small victories. Soap tooth powder, a comb knowing they're not enough. The pump's behind you, but its shadow lingers, a reminder that in this world, even water can kill. You're still trudging through the grimy streets of Victorian London, the taste of that risky pump water lingering in your mouth, a metallic reminder of the city's invisible dangers. Your soap tooth powder and comb are tucked in your pocket, small shields against the relentless filth, coal dust, sewage, and the ever-present itch of your scalp. You're starting to feel like you're carrying the city's grime on your skin, your clothes, your very soul. Now you're facing another Herculean task: laundry. In an era with no washing machines or clean water, keeping your clothes clean is a back-breaking, endless chore. You're about to dive into the gritty world of Victorian laundry, where every scrub is a fight against the odds. You head back to your tenement, weaving through alleys where the air's thick with smoke and the sour tang of waste. Inside the dim room's familiar damp walls, a creaking floor, and the faint stench of that chamber pot. You've got a pile of clothes in the corner, stiff with dirt and sweat, and you know washing them's going to be a marathon. You grab a wooden bucket, your knuckles already aching at the thought of what's coming. The only laundry room here is a shared courtyard pump, and you're not looking forward to the trek or the water quality. You haul the bucket to the courtyard, where the pump's surrounded by women bent over their own washing. The water's as cloudy as ever, probably laced with cesspit runoff, but it's all you've got. You fill the bucket, the cold biting your hands, and lug it back to the tenement. Your washing station is a tin tub on the floor, and you've got your precious soap bar, but you're using it sparingly. Laundry's a soap eater, and you can't afford to run out. You start scrubbing a shirt, the fabric heavy with grime, and your arms burn within minutes. This isn't cleaning, it's combat. Here's the mainstream fact: laundry in Victorian Britain was a grueling manual process, especially for the working class. By the 1850s, most households did laundry weekly, if they could, using cold water, harsh soap, and sheer muscle. Washboards made of wood or metal were common, but they tore clothes and hands alike. You're scraping your shirt against a splintered board, the soap barely lathering in the murky water. Public washhouses like the one at the bathhouse you visited offered hot water and tubs for a fee, but they're a luxury most can't afford. You're stuck here, and your knuckles are already raw. Now for the quirky tidbit. Some Victorians used urine as a laundry detergent, believing its ammonia content cut grease. You're gagging at the thought, grateful for your soap, even if it's gritty. The practice wasn't widespread, but it was common enough in rural areas and among the poorest who couldn't afford soap at all. Historians still argue whether this was a clever use of resources or just a desperate last resort in a world short on options. You're sticking with your soap, but you're starting to understand why someone might try anything to get a stain out. The sensory assault's relentless. The tenement's air is damp, smelling of mold and smoke, and the tub's waters is gray, flecked with dirt from your shirt. Your hands sting from the cold, and the soap's harsh bite makes your skin itch. The courtyard outside hums with noise, women gossiping, kids splashing in puddles, and the creak of the pump handle. Your shirt's still dingy despite your efforts, and you're sweating, which feels like a cruel irony. Here's a Victorian joke to lighten the mood they called Laundry Day Blue Monday, because it left you bruised blue and wishing it was over. You're not laughing, your arms are screaming. Let's talk about the process. After scrubbing, you rinse the clothes in another bucket of water, which is just as dirty as the first. Then comes wringing, twisting the heavy fabric until your hands cramp. Drying's no easier. There's no space inside, so you hang the clothes on a line in the courtyard where they'll collect coal dust before they're dry. If it rains, which it often does, you're starting over. The wealthy have servants to handle this, maybe even a mangle to press clothes, but you're on your own, and it's a full-day job. You're starting to see why people wore clothes until they were practically walking on their own. Let's zoom out. Laundry wasn't just a chore, it was a public health issue. Dirty clothes harbored lice, bacteria, and disease, contributing to the spread of typhus and skin infections. Public health reports from the 1860s noted that slum dwellers often wore the same clothes for weeks, not out of laziness, but necessity. Water, soap, and time were luxuries. You're one of the lucky ones with your soap and a bucket, but even you can't get your clothes truly clean. The water's too dirty, the soap's too weak, and the city's grime is too strong. Here's another oddity. Some Victorians believed frequent washing weakened clothes like water could somehow ruin fabric's vitality. You're tempted to scoff, but when you're staring at a shirt already fraying from your washboard, maybe they had a point. You're not buying it, though. Your modern brain's screaming for a washing machine, but you're stuck in a world where laundry's a test of endurance. You keep scrubbing your hands red and sore, knowing you're fighting a losing battle. You glance at the other women in the courtyard, their faces set in grim determination. One's beating a sheet with a stick, another's wringing out a petticoat, her hands cracked and bleeding. They're not just washing clothes, they're fighting for respectability, for a chance to look decent in a world quick to judge. You feel a pang of solidarity, but you're also exhausted. You're tempted to offer your soap, but you know it's a lifeline you can't spare. Survival's teaching you hard lessons, and generosity's a risk you can't always take. As you hang your shirt on the line, a gust of wind brings a cloud of soot speckling the damp fabric. You curse under your breath, knowing you'll never outrun the city's dirt. You pass a tenement where a woman's ironing with a heavy metal contraption heated over a fire, her face flushed with heat. The effort's endless, and the results are fleeting. You're starting to understand why that bathhouse with its steaming washhouses felt like a dream even if it cost a fortune. You're done for now. Your hands aching, your shirt barely cleaner than when you started. You head back inside the tub's gray water sloshing as you empty it into the courtyard cesspit. The cycle's relentless wash where dirty repeat, and you're trapped in it. You pass a group of kids, their clothes ragged and stiff with grime, and the sight's sobering. They'll grow up in this cycle if they survive at all. Your soap's a small victory, but it's not enough to change the game. You keep moving, the tenement fading behind you, but the weight of laundry lingers on your hands, your mind, your spirit. You're starting to feel the exhaustion of Victorian hygiene, where every task, from washing your hair to scrubbing your clothes, is a reminder of how little you control. The city's a relentless machine, and you're just a cog, grinding through the filth, clutching your soap like it's the only thing keeping you human. You're still slogging through the grimy streets of Victorian London, the ache in your hands, a lingering reminder of that brutal laundry session. Your soap tooth powder and comb are still in your pocket, small bulwarks against the city's relentless filth, coal dust sewage, and the ever-present itch of your scalp. Your clothes, barely cleaner despite your efforts, are already collecting the street's grime again. You're starting to feel like you'll never outrun the dirt, but now you're facing a new challenge, masking the odors that cling to you like a second skin. In this era, perfume isn't just a luxury. It's a desperate attempt to hide the stench of unwashed bodies and filthy streets. You're about to dive into the world of Victorian scents, where a spritz of lavender is your only defense against the city's reek. You weave through a bustling market, the air thick with the smells of rotting produce, sweat, and that familiar sewage tang. You spot a stall tucked between a fishmonger and a baker, its table lined with tiny glass bottles glinting in the dim light. The vendor, a woman with a sharp nose and a stained apron, beckons you over promising essences to rival Paris. You're skeptical, but the thought of smelling like anything other than the city's filth is tempting. You pick up a bottle labeled rose water, its scent faint but sweet, a stark contrast to the market stench. It's pricey, 4 pence for a vial, but you're desperate to feel human again. Here's the mainstream fact. Perfumes and scented waters were widely used in Victorian Britain, especially by the middle and upper classes, to mask body odor and environmental smells. By the 1850s, commercial perfumery was growing with brands like Piers and Yardley selling floral waters and colognes. But these were expensive, so most people relied on homemade concoctions, rose water, lavender oil, or vinegar-based scents. You splash a few drops of the rose water on your neck, and for a moment the city's stink retreats. It's not a cure, but it's a reprieve, and you'll take it. You step back into the crowd, the vial tucked in your pocket next to your soap. The rose water's fading, already overwhelmed by the market's odors. You notice a woman nearby, her dress, patched but sprinkled with a cloying lavender scent. She's trying to pass as respectable, but the perfume's fighting a losing battle against weeks of unwashed fabric. You're starting to see why perfume's so popular. It's not about luxury. It's about survival in a world where everyone smells like they've rolled in a cesspit. Your own clothes, fresh from that grueling wash, are already picking up the street's grime, and you're grateful for the rose water's fleeting mask. Now for the quirky tidbit. Some Victorians used scent bags, sachets of dried herbs, or flowers tucked into clothes, or hung around the neck to fend off odors. You spot a kid with a small cloth bag tied to his belt, probably stuffed with cloves or mint, and it's almost charming until you remember it's covering the smell of unwashed skin and dirty rags. Historians still argue whether these scent bags were a practical solution or just a placebo for a society drowning in filth. Either way, you're sticking with your rose water, even if it's barely holding on. The sensory assault's relentless. The market's air is heavy, a mix of fish sweat and the sour bite of rotting vegetables. Your rose water's faint sweetness is like a whisper in a storm, and your clothes are itching again, heavy with damp off and dust. The noise is deafening, hawkers shouting, carts rattling, and a dog barking somewhere nearby. Your scalp's still tender from that lice combing, and you're hyper-aware of every speck of grime on your skin. Here's a Victorian joke to lighten the mood they called cheap perfume stink buster, because it tried and failed to outdo the city's stench. You're not laughing, but you get the struggle. Let's talk about the reality of body odor. Bathing's rare, as you learned at the bathhouse, and soap's a luxury you're hoarding. Most people go weeks without a proper wash, and clothes, even clean ones, carry the smell of sweat and smoke. Perfume's your only weapon, but it's like putting a bandage on a broken leg. You splash another drop of rose water on your wrists, hoping it'll last, but the heat of the crowd's already stealing it away. You notice a dandy in a top hat, his cologne so strong it cuts through the market's reek. He's got money, clearly, but even he can't escape the city's grip entirely. His cuffs are dingy, just like yours. Let's zoom out. Body odor wasn't just a personal issue, it was a social one. Smelling decent was a marker of class and respectability, but it was nearly impossible for the poor. Public health reports from the 1860s noted that overcrowding and lack of washing facilities made body odor universal in slums, contributing to the stigma against the working class. You're starting to see why that bathhouse and soap were such big deals. They offered a chance to fake respectability, even if just for a day. Your rose water's a small step in that direction, but it's not enough to fool anyone for long. Here's another oddity. Some Victorians believed strong perfumes could ward off disease, tying back to that miasma theory you've heard about. They'd douse themselves in lavender or camphor, thinking it protected against bad air. You're tempted to roll your eyes, but when you're surrounded by the city's stench, maybe a cloud of perfume feels like armor. You're not buying it, though. Your modern brain knows germs don't care about your scent, and that pump water you drank earlier is a bigger threat than any miasma. You keep moving, the market fading behind you, but the odors follow. You pass a tenement where a woman's hanging laundry, her clothes reeking despite her efforts. She's sprinkled them with something, maybe violet water, but it's not enough. You feel a pang of solidarity. You're both fighting the same losing battle. You're tempted to offer a drop of your rose water, but you know it's a luxury you can't spare. Survival's a harsh teacher, and you're learning to hoard your resources, even the small ones. As you walk, you pass a fancy chemist's shop, its window boasting eau de cologne for $1 a bottle. You're jealous of whoever can afford that, but your rose water's all you've got. You notice a group of factory workers, their clothes stiff with grease, no perfume to mask their smell. The class divide's stark, and you're caught in the middle, not poor enough to give up, but not rich enough to win. Your rose water's a small victory, but it's fading fast, and the city's grime is closing in. You're starting to feel the weight of this era's hygiene crisis. Every task, from washing clothes to masking odors, is a reminder of how little you control. The city's a relentless machine, and you're just a speck clutching your soap, your tooth powder, your comb, and now your rose water. You keep walking, the market's noise fading, but the stench lingers, a constant reminder that in this world, even smelling human is a fight you can't quite win. You're still battling through the grimy streets of Victorian London, the faint scent of rose water on your neck, already fading under the city's relentless assault of coal dust, sewage, and sweat. Your soap, tooth, powder, comb, and now that precious vial of rose water are tucked in your pocket. Small defenses against a world that seems determined to bury you in filth. Your clothes, barely clean from that exhausting laundry session, are already gritty again, and the weight of it all, physical and mental, is wearing you down. Now you're facing a new challenge, keeping your skin from succumbing to the sores, rashes, and infections that thrive in this dirty, damp environment. You're about to dive into the gritty reality of Victorian skincare, where every scratch is a potential disaster. You slip into a quieter alley, the market's chaos fading, though the air's still thick with smoke and the sour tang of refuse. You find a corner to pause, leaning against a damp wall, and notice your hands red, cracked and stinging from scrubbing clothes in that harsh soap and tainted water. Your face feels tight, coated in a film of dust and sweat, and you're starting to itch in places you can't quite reach. You've heard whispers of slum sores, skin infections that spread like wildfire in tenements, and you're not eager to join that club. You need something to soothe your skin. But in this era, skincare's less about beauty and more about survival. You head to an apothecary, its windows grimy, but promising salves and ointments. Inside, the air's sharp with the smell of herbs and something chemical like burnt metal. The apothecary, a grizzled man with a stained waistcoat, offers you a small jar of Dr. Bell's skin balm, a waxy paste that smells of lard and lavender. It's 2p another dent in your dwindling funds, but you're desperate. You rub a bit on your hands and it's greasy, heavy, but it takes the edge off the stinging. This is skincare Victorian style, less about glow and more about keeping your skin from cracking open. Here's the mainstream fact. Skin infections were rampant in Victorian slums, fueled by poor hygiene, contaminated water, and overcrowded living. By the 1850s, public health reports noted that boils, rashes, and scabies were common, especially among the poor, who lacked access to clean water or soap. Homemade remedies like lard-based ointments or herbal poultices were the norm, often mixed with dubious ingredients like lead or arsenic. You're lucky your balm's just lard and lavender, but you're still wary. It's not exactly sterile, and you're rubbing it into skin already battered by the city's grime. Now for the quirky tidbit. Some Victorians used goose grease as a cure-all for skin ailments, slathering it on everything from burns to rashes. You're grateful for your jar of balm, but you can't help imagining the smell of goose grease caked on your hands, mingling with the city's stench. Historians still argue whether these remedies were based on folk wisdom or just desperation in a world with no real medical solutions. Either way, you're sticking with your balm, even if it leaves you feeling like a greased axle. The sensory assault's relentless. The apothecary's shop is dim, lit by a single lamp, casting shadows on shelves of murky jars. The balm's greasy texture clings to your fingers, and its lavender scent, though pleasant, is quickly drowned by the alley's reek of sewage and smoke. Your skin's raw, itching under the layer of balm, and your clothes are heavy, scratching against your neck. The street outside hums with noise, cartwheels rattling, a woman shouting at a vendor, and the distant clang of a factory. Your scalp's still tender from that lice combing, and you're hyper-aware of every speck of dust settling on your face. Here's a Victorian joke to lighten the mood they called bad skin slum tattoos, because everyone in the tenements wore them. You're not laughing, your hands are proof enough. Let's talk about the reality of skin health. Bathing's rare, as you've learned, and soap's too harsh for daily use on sensitive skin. The water you've been using, whether for laundry or washing your face, is often tainted, carrying bacteria that turn small cuts into oozing sores. You've seen people in the market with red, inflamed patches, scratching until they bleed, and you're determined to avoid that fate. You rub more balm on your knuckles, hoping it's enough, but you know it's a bandage on a deeper problem. The city's dirt is relentless, and your skin's taking the brunt of it. Let's zoom out. Skin infections weren't just a personal issue, they were a public health crisis. Scabies, impetigo, and cellulitis spread rapidly in slums, where families shared beds and clothes, and lice, as you've experienced, were everywhere. Public health reports from the 1860s estimated that skin diseases affected up to a third of slum dwellers, worsened by malnutrition and lack of sanitation. You're starting to see why your soap and that bathhouse visit were such big deals. They offered a fleeting chance to protect your skin, even if the relief was temporary. Your balm's a small victory, but it's not enough to keep the city's filth at bay. Here's another oddity. Some Victorians believed skin infections were caused by impure blood, cured by bleeding or purging. You've heard of barbers offering leech treatments, and you're glad to stick with your balm, dubious as it is. Your modern brain's screaming for antibiotics, but you're stuck in a world where medicine's more guesswork than science. You rub the balm into a cut on your finger, hoping it doesn't fester, and try not to think about the horror stories of gangrene you've overheard in the market. You step back into the alley, the apothecary's shop fading behind you. The balm's helped, but your skin's still tight, and you're itching again. Maybe from the city's grime, maybe from nerves. You pass a woman with a face covered in white powder, likely lid-based, used to hide sores or blemishes. She's trying to look refined, but the powder's flaking, revealing red patches underneath. You're starting to see the pattern. Hygiene here is a performance, a desperate attempt to seem clean in a world that's anything but. Your rosewater and balm are props in the same act, but they're not fooling anyone for long. As you walk, you pass a group of factory workers, their hands cracked and blackened from grease and coal dust. They're scratching just like you, and you wonder if they've got access to anything like your balm. The class divide's stark wealthy folks might have fancy creams or private doctors, but you're all fighting the same dirt. You're one of the lucky ones with your soap and balm, but even you can't escape the city's grip. Your skin's a battleground, and every day's a new skirmish. You keep moving the alley, opening into a wider street, but the grime's still there, coating your skin, your clothes, your thoughts. You're exhausted not just from the physical toll, but from the mental strain of dodging infection at every turn. The city's a relentless beast, and you're just a speck, clutching your soap tooth powder, comb rose water, and now your balm. They're small victories, but they're not enough to win the war. You're learning fast that hygiene here isn't about comfort. It's about keeping your body from betraying you, one greasy smear at a time. You're still trudging through the filthy streets of Victorian London, the greasy residue of that skin balm mixing with the city's ever-present coal dust, sewage stench, and sweat. Your pocket's a small arsenal, now soap tooth, powder comb, rose water, and that jar of balm, but they're flimsy defenses against a world that coats you in grime faster than you can clean it off. Your skin's still tight, your clothes are stiff with dirt despite your laundry efforts, and the faint scent of rose water is long gone. Now you're facing a new ordeal keeping your shoes clean in a city where every step is a gamble with mud waste and worse. You're about to dive into the gritty reality of Victorian footwear maintenance, where a single misstep can ruin your day and your boots. You navigate a narrow street, the cobblestones slick with a mix of rain muck, and what you're pretty sure isn't just mud. Your boots, already worn from weeks of trudging, are caked with filth, the leather cracking under the strain. Clean shoes aren't just about vanity here, they're a necessity. Dirty boots track disease into homes, wear out faster, and mark you as someone who can't afford to care. You're headed to a corner of the tenement courtyard where you've seen people cleaning their shoes, hoping to salvage yours before they fall apart completely. You reach the courtyard, where a shared pump spits out the same cloudy water you've learned to distrust. A few others are there, scrubbing boots with rags and sticks, their faces grim with focus. You find a spot, pull out a scrap of cloth from your pocket, and start scraping the worst of the muck off your boots. The water's cold, and the rag's already turning black, but you've got no choice. You're tempted to use your precious soap, but it's too valuable for this, so you rely on elbow grease and a stick you found nearby. The leather's looking marginally better, but the stench of the mud lingers, and you're not sure you're winning. Here's the mainstream fact. Keeping shoes clean in Victorian cities was a constant struggle, especially for the working class. By the 1850s, streets were paved with cobblestones or dirt, often covered in horse manure, human waste, and industrial runoff. Leather boots, the standard footwear, were expensive and hard to maintain, requiring regular cleaning and polishing to prevent rot. You're scraping at a stubborn clump of something foul, and your hands are freezing, but you know clean boots could mean the difference between respectability and being dismissed as a beggar. Public bootblacking boys offered polishing services for a penny, but you're too broke for that today. Now for the quirky tidbit. Some Victorians used stale beer to polish their boots, believing it gave leather a natural shine. You're gagging at the thought, imagining the smell of beer-soaked mud, and you're glad to stick with water, even if it's murky. Historians still argue whether this was a practical trick. Beer's acidity might have helped, or just another oddity born of desperation in a world short on proper supplies. Either way, you're not wasting good beer on your boots, not when you can barely afford bread. The sensory assault's relentless. The courtyard air's damp, reeking of sewage from that nearby cesspit, and your hands are numb from the cold water. The rag's gritty texture scrapes your fingers, and the mud smell, sharp, earthy, and rotten, makes your stomach turn. The courtyard's alive with noise, kids shouting, a woman cursing as her bucket tips over, and the rhythmic squeak of the pump. Your boots are still dingy, and your clothes are spattered with muddy water, adding to the grime you've been fighting all day. Here's a Victorian joke to lighten the mood they called dirty boots. Street medals, because they showed you'd survived another day in London. You're not laughing your aching hands, and ruined boots aren't much of a trophy. Let's talk about the stakes. Dirty shoes weren't just an aesthetic problem, they were a health hazard. Mud and waste carried bacteria spreading diseases like cholera and typhus when tracked into homes. You've seen families in the tenement, their floors coated in the same filth you're scraping off, and you know it's a losing battle. Leather boots, if not dried and cleaned properly, could rot or crack, and replacements were a fortune most couldn't afford. You're careful to shake the water off your boots, hoping to preserve them, but the damp's already seeping in, and you're dreading the blisters to come. Let's zoom out. Footwear maintenance was a microcosm of the Victorian hygiene crisis. Streets were open sewers, and the working class who walked everywhere bore the brunt of it. Public health reports from the 1860s noted that poor sanitation, dirty streets, tainted water contributed to skin infections and respiratory issues worsened by the filth people carried home on their shoes. You're starting to see why that bathhouse felt like a sanctuary. Even with its flaws, it offered a chance to wash more than just your body. Your rag and stick are pitiful tools, but they're all you've got to keep the city's dirt from claiming you completely. Here's another oddity. Some Victorians believed mud had healing properties, using it as a poultice for wounds. You're tempted to scoff, staring at the foul muck on your boots. But when medicine's scarce, maybe desperation makes mud seem magical. You're not buying it, your modern brains screaming about infection, and you're scrubbing harder, hoping to avoid the sores you've seen on others' feet. The city's a minefield, and your boots are your only armor. You keep at it. Your hands raw, the leather starting to look passable but far from clean. You glance at the others in the courtyard, a man blacking his boots with a homemade paste, a woman rinsing hers with a grimace. They're fighting the same battle, and you feel a flicker of solidarity, though you're too tired to act on it. You're tempted to share your rag, but it's falling apart, and you need it more than ever. Survival's a harsh lesson, and you're learning to hold on to what little you have. As you finish, you stand your boots damp, but less filthy. You shake them out, hoping they'll dry before mold sets in. You pass a street vendor selling boot polish made of who knows what, his pitch loud and desperate. You're skeptical. His jars look like they're filled with the same mud you just scraped off. The class divide's stark, wealthy folks have servants to polish their shoes, maybe even new boots every season, while you're stuck with this pair praying they last. Your rag's a small victory, but it's not enough to outrun the city's filth. You keep moving, the courtyard fading behind you, but the weight of the task lingers on your hands, your boots, your mind. You pass a group of kids, their bare feet black with dirt, and the sight's sobering. They'll never know clean shoes, let alone the luxury of soap or rose water. You're one of the lucky ones with your small arsenal, but even you can't escape the city's grip. The streets are a battlefield, and every step's a reminder that hygiene here isn't about comfort. It's about survival, one muddy scrape at a time. You're still slogging through the grimy streets of Victorian London, the damp weight of your freshly scrubbed boots, dragging with every step, the city's filth, coal dust, sewage, and sweat clinging to you like a curse. Your pocket's a tiny fortress, now holding your soap tooth, powder comb, rose water, and that greasy balm, but they're flimsy shields against a world that buries you in dirt faster than you can fight it off. Your skin's tight, your clothes are stiff with grime, despite your laundry efforts, and the faint memory of rose water is long gone. Now you're facing a new hurdle, keeping your home, such as it is, free of the city's filth. In a cramped tenement room shared with a family, cleaning your living space is a Sisyphean task where every sweep pushes the dirt back at you. You duck into the tenement, the air inside heavy with damp mold and the lingering stench of that chamber pot you emptied days ago. The room's a mess. Straw mattresses on the floor, a wobbly table cluttered with pots, and walls streaked with soot. You share this space with a family of 6, their belongings spilling into your corner, and every surface is coated in the city's grime, tracked in on boots and clothes. You've got a broom, a splintered thing borrowed from a neighbor, and a bucket of that same cloudy pump water you've learned to dread. Cleaning this room feels like trying to bail out a sinking ship with a teaspoon, but you're determined to try. You start sweeping the broom, kicking up dust that makes you cough the air thick with particles that settle back on the floor as soon as you move them. The straw mattresses are the worst, crawling with lice and reeking of sweat. You shake one out, wincing as dust clouds rise, and you're reminded of that lice-combing nightmare. The family's kids watch their bare feet, black with dirt. And you know this is a losing battle. The city's filth seeps through every crack, and there's no keeping it out. You splash some water on the floor, hoping to dampen the dust, but it just turns to mud, sticking to your boots again. Here's the mainstream fact: housekeeping in Victorian slums was a brutal, endless task. By the 1850s, tenements were overcrowded with families of 10 or more, packed into single rooms, sharing beds and floors. Cleaning meant battling dirt vermin and damp with little more than brooms, rags, and tainted water. Public health reports noted that poor sanitation, filthy homes shared bedding-fueled diseases like typhus and tuberculosis, which thrived in these conditions. You're sweeping harder now, your arms aching, but the floor's still gritty, and you're starting to see why clean is a fantasy here. Now for the quirky tidbit: some Victorians sprinkled tea leaves on floors before sweeping, believing the damp leaves trapped dust and added a fresh scent. You're skeptical, imagining the mess of soggy leaves mixed with mud, and you're glad to stick with your broom, even if it's useless. Historians still argue whether this was a clever trick. Tea leaves might absorb some dust, or just another oddity born of desperation in a world with no real cleaning tools. Either way, you're not wasting tea you can't afford on a floor that's practically alive with dirt. The sensory assault's relentless. The room's air is heavy, smelling of mold sweat, and the faint ammonia of that cesspit outside. Your broom's bristles scrape the floor, a grating sound that echoes in your skull, and your hands are gritty from gripping the splintered handle. The kids' chatter mixes with the creak of floorboards and the distant shout of a street vendor. Your boots are muddy again, your clothes heavy with damp, and your skin's itching under that layer of balm. Here's a Victorian joke to lighten the mood. They called tenement floors dirt carpets because they were never clean, just decorated with grime. You're not laughing your aching arms, and the muddy floors are proof enough. Let's talk about the stakes. A dirty home wasn't just an eyesore, it was a death trap. Vermin like rats and lice carried disease, and damp, filthy floors bred mold that triggered respiratory issues. You've seen the family's grandmother coughing in the corner, and you know the air you're breathing isn't helping. Cleaning's not just about appearances, it's about keeping sickness at bay. But with tainted water and no proper tools, it's like fighting a tidal wave with a rag. You're tempted to use your soap, but it's too precious, and the water's so dirty, it'd probably make things worse. Let's zoom out. The state of tenements reflected the broader hygiene crisis of Victorian cities. The Industrial Revolution packed millions into urban slums, but sanitation lagged far behind. Public health reports from the 1860s described homes where dirt was part of the furniture, with families too poor and exhausted to clean regularly. Reformers like Florence Nightingale pushed for better ventilation and sanitation, but change was slow, and you're stuck in the thick of it sweeping a floor that'll be filthy again by nightfall. Your broom's a small weapon, but it's no match for the city's relentless grime. Here's another oddity. Some Victorians believed sweeping at night stirred up bad spirits, bringing illness or bad luck. You're tempted to roll your eyes, but when you're surrounded by coughing kids and a room that smells like a sewer, maybe there's something to their fears. Your modern brain's screaming for disinfectant, but you're stuck in a world where cleaning's more ritual than science. You keep sweeping, hoping to at least make a dent, but the dust keeps settling, mocking your efforts. You glance at the family's mother scrubbing a pot with the same cloudy water you're using. Her hands are raw just like yours, and she's muttering about the dirt that never leaves. You feel a pang of solidarity. You're both fighting the same unwinnable war. You're tempted to offer your soap, but you know it's a lifeline you can't spare. Survival's a harsh teacher, and you're learning to hoard your resources even when guilt tugs at you. The kids are playing in the corner, their feet tracking more dirt, and you know this room will never be clean, not really. As you finish, the floor is slightly less gritty, but it's a hollow victory. You shake out the broom dust clouding around you and empty the muddy water into the courtyard cesspit where it belongs. You pass a neighbor airing out, bedding a futile attempt to freshen straw that's probably crawling with lice. The effort's endless, and the results are fleeting. You're starting to understand why that bathhouse with its steaming tubs felt like a dream, even if it was a grimy one. Your broom's a small step, but it's not enough to change the game. You step outside the tenement's damp air, giving way to the street's smoky haze. You pass a group of workers, their clothes and faces as dirty as the floors they sleep on, and the sight's sobering. They're trapped in this cycle just like you, and cleanliness is a luxury none of you can afford. You're one of the lucky ones with your soap and broom, but even you can't escape the city's grip. The dirt's everywhere on your boots, your skin, your lungs, and every sweep's a reminder that hygiene here isn't about comfort. It's about survival, one dusty stroke at a time. You're still trudging through the muck of Victorian London, the broom's splinters still stinging your hands from that futile attempt to clean the tenement floor. Your pocket's a lifeline, soap tooth, powder comb, rose water, and that greasy balm, but they're no match for the city's relentless filth, coal dust sewage, and the sour reek of unwashed lives. Your boots are damp, your clothes gritty despite your laundry struggles, and your skin's tight under a film of grime. Now you're facing another grim reality, keeping your food safe in a world where contamination is as common as the rats scurrying through the streets. You're about to dive into the gritty challenge of Victorian food hygiene, where every bite is a gamble with your health. You slip back into the tenement, the air thick with mold and the faint stench of that cesspit outside. Your corner holds a small stash of food, a loaf of bread, some cheese wrapped in cloth, and a few apples all bought from the market with your dwindling coins. The table's a mess coated in dust and crumbs, and you know the rats have been at it. You've seen their droppings near your mattress, and the thought of them nibbling your bread makes your stomach churn. You need to protect your food. But in a room shared with a family of 6, with no proper storage, it's a battle against filth and vermin. You grab a rag, and that cloudy pump water you've come to dread wiping down the table as best you can. The water's gritty, leaving streaks, but it's better than nothing. You unwrap the cheese, noticing a faint, moldy edge, not the good kind, and cut it away with a knife you've cleaned with your precious soap. The bread's stale, and you check it for rat bites, relieved to find it intact. You're hungry, but you're hyper-aware of the risks. The apples look safe, but you rinse them in the murky water, hoping it's not worse than the dirt you're washing off. Eating here feels like playing roulette with every mouthful. Here's the mainstream fact. Food hygiene in Victorian slums was abysmal, contributing to widespread illness. By the 1850s, food was often contaminated by poor storage, dirty water, and vermin, with markets selling spoiled meat and bread, bulked with sawdust or chalk. Public health reports noted that diseases like dysentery and food poisoning were rampant, especially among the poor, who couldn't afford fresh produce or proper storage. You're cutting into your bread, praying it's safe, but the gritty texture and faint sour smell make you wary. The family's watching their own meager meal spread out, and you know they're taking the same risks. Now for the quirky tidbit. Some Victorians used arsenic to preserve food, sprinkling it on meat to keep flies away. You're horrified, thankful for your plain bread and cheese, even if they're not exactly fresh. Historians still argue whether this was ignorance. Arsenic was a known poison, or a desperate attempt to stretch scarce food in a world with no refrigeration. Either way, you're sticking to your knife and rag, hoping to keep the rats and rot at bay without resorting to poison. The sensory assault's relentless. The tenement's air is heavy, smelling of damp straw and the family's boiled cabbage, which mingles with the cesspit's ammonia, stink drifting through the window. Your hands are sticky from the apples, and the rag's damp grit makes your skin crawl. The room's alive with noise, kids bickering, the mother scolding, and the creak of floorboards underfoot. Your boots are still damp from cleaning, and your clothes itch heavy with the city's grime. Here's a Victorian joke to lighten the mood they called bad food slum stew, because you never knew what was in it, rat rot or both. You're not laughing, your cheese's dubious smell is too real. Let's talk about the stakes. Contaminated food wasn't just a bad meal, it was a killer. Cholera, typhoid, and diarrhea spread through tainted food and water, with slums hit hardest due to overcrowding and poor sanitation. You've seen vendors in the market selling meat that's gray and slimy, and you know the milk's often watered down with pump water, carrying the same germs you're trying to avoid. You're careful wiping your knife on your sleeve, but it's not enough. The rats are relentless, and the air's so damp your bread's already softening, inviting mold. You're starting to see why hunger's sometimes safer than eating. Let's zoom out. Food hygiene was a microcosm of the Victorian sanitation crisis. The Industrial Revolution brought millions to cities, but markets and homes couldn't keep up with demand. Public health reports from the 1860s described tenements where food was stored on floors crawling with vermin, and families shared pots washed in contaminated water. Reformers pushed for better food regulations, but change was slow, and you're stuck in the middle, guarding your apples like they're gold. Your rag and knife are pitiful tools, but they're all you've got to keep your food from turning deadly. Here's another oddity. Some Victorians believed eating spoiled food built character and resistance to disease. You're tempted to scoff, staring at your moldy cheese, but when fresh food's a luxury, maybe they had to believe something to keep going. Your modern brain's screaming about bacteria, but you're stuck in a world where food safety's a guess, and every bite's a leap of faith. You wrap the cheese tighter, hoping the cloth keeps the rats out, and try not to think about the dysentery cases you've heard about in the market. You glance at the family eating their own meal, boiled potatoes, and a bit of bacon probably bought cheap because it was turning. The mother's cutting away bad spots, just like you, her face set in grim determination. You feel a pang of solidarity. You're all fighting the same battle against filth and hunger. You're tempted to share an apple, but you know you can't spare it. Survival's teaching you to hoard, even when guilt gnaws at you. The kids are chewing slowly, their eyes on your bread, and you look away, focusing on your own small stash. As you eat, you sit on the mattress, careful not to drop crumbs. That'll attract more rats. The bread's tough, the cheese sharp, but it's food, and you're grateful. You rinse your hands with a splash of water, knowing it's not clean, but it's better than nothing. You pass a window where a neighbor's airing out a sack of flour, probably crawling with weevils, and the sight's sobering. You're one of the lucky ones with your soap and knife, but even you can't escape the city's grip. The tenement's a petri dish, and every bite's a risk you're forced to take. You keep moving, stepping outside to escape the room's stifling air, but the street's no better, smoky, damp, and buzzing with flies. You pass a vendor selling pies, their crusts suspiciously shiny, and you wonder what's inside, meat or mystery. The class divides. Stark, wealthy folks have pantries and cooks, while you're guarding your bread from rats. Your small arsenal's a lifeline, but it's not enough to outrun the city's filth. The tenement's behind you, but the weight of food hygiene lingers, a reminder that in this world, even eating is a fight for survival, one cautious bite at a time. You're still navigating the grimy streets of Victorian London, the taste of that stale bread and dubious cheese lingering in your mouth, a stark reminder of the city's relentless grip on your survival. Your pocket's a small armory soap tooth, powder comb, rose water, and that greasy balm, but they're flimsy defenses against the ever-present filth, coal dust, sewage, and the sour stench of unwashed bodies. Your boots are still damp from cleaning your clothes, gritty despite your efforts, and your skin's tight under a layer of grime. Now you're facing a new challenge, keeping your teeth and mouth clean in a world where oral hygiene is a luxury and decay is as common as the rats in your tenement. You're about to dive into the gritty reality of Victorian dental care, where every brush is a battle against rot and pain. You duck back into the tenement, the air heavy with mold, and the faint ammonia reek from the courtyard cesspit. The dim room's familiar straw mattresses, a cluttered table, and the family of 6, you share it with their coughs and chatter filling the space. Your tooth powder, a gritty mix of chalk and herbs bought at the market, is your only weapon against the ache starting in your back molar. You've seen people in the streets, their mouths black with rot, and you're determined to avoid that fate. You grab a small twig you've been using as a makeshift toothbrush, your hands still raw from sweeping, and prepare for the tedious task of cleaning your teeth. You pour a pinch of tooth powder into your palm, dip the twig in that cloudy pump water you've come to loathe, and start scrubbing. The powder's gritty tasting of chalk and something faintly minty, but it's harsh, scraping your gums until they sting. Your molar throbs with every pass, and you're careful not to press too hard, fearing you'll worsen it. The family's kids watch curious, their own teeth yellowed and uneven. Tooth powder's a luxury here, and most rely on chewing sticks, or nothing at all. You're fighting a losing battle, but you're not giving up, not yet. Here's the mainstream fact. Dental care in Victorian Britain was primitive, especially for the poor. By the 1850s, tooth decay was rampant due to poor diets. Think bread sugar and tea and lack of hygiene. Tooth powders often made of chalk, charcoal, or even ground bone were common, but abrasive, and toothbrushes were expensive, so most used twigs or rags. Dentists existed, but their services, crude extractions, or fillings with lead, were costly and often dangerous. You're scrubbing harder the powder gritty in your mouth, and you're grateful for your twig, even if it's splintering. Public health reports noted that tooth loss was near universal among slum dwellers by their 30s, and you're not eager to join them. Now, for the quirky tidbit, some Victorians used soot from chimneys as a tooth powder, believing it 27's whitening power. You're horrified imagining the taste of coal dust mixed with your tooth powder, and you're thankful for your chalky mix, abrasive as it is. Historians still argue whether soot was effective or just another desperate measure in a world with no proper dental care. Either way, you're sticking to your powder, even if it's barely better than dirt. The sensory assault's relentless. The tenement's air is damp, smelling of straw and cabbage, and the tooth powder's chalky grit coats your tongue, making you gag. Your gums sting, and the twig's rough texture scrapes your fingers still sore from cleaning boots and floors. The room's alive with noise, the kids chatter, the mothers cough, and the creak of floorboards. Your clothes are heavy with grime, your boots damp, and the faint sting of balm on your skin reminds you of the city's filth. Here's a Victorian joke to lighten the mood they called bad teeth slum pearls, because they were as common as dirt and just as unwanted. You're not laughing your throbbing molars too real. Let's talk about the stakes. Poor oral hygiene wasn't just cosmetic. It led to infections, abscesses, and even sepsis, which could be fatal in a world with no antibiotics. You've seen market vendors with swollen jaws, their teeth pulled by street dentists with pliers, and you're desperate to keep your mouth intact. Brushing's a small defense, but the water's tainted, and the powder's abrasive, so every scrub's a gamble. You rinse your mouth with a sip of that risky pump water, spitting it into a cracked cup, hoping you've done more good than harm. Let's zoom out. Oral hygiene was a microcosm of the Victorian sanitation crisis. Overcrowding, poor nutrition, and lack of clean water made dental care nearly impossible for the poor. Public health reports from the 1860s described slums where entire families shared one rag for cleaning, and tooth decay was just another burden of poverty. Reformers pushed for better hygiene education, but toothbrushes and powders were luxuries, and you're one of the lucky ones with your twig and powder. Still, you're fighting a city that's winning your teeth, aching as the grime creeps back. Here's another oddity. Some Victorians chewed cloves or cinnamon to freshen their breath, believing it fought decay. You're tempted to try, but cloves are pricey, and your tooth powder's all you've got. Your modern brain's screaming for fluoride and a dentist's drill. But you're stuck in a world where a toothache can mean agony or worse. You scrub gently, hoping to stave off the rot, and try not to think about the horror stories of jaw infections you've overheard in the market. You glance at the family, their teeth stained from tea, and neglect eating their meager meal. The mother's chewing, slowly wincing, and you wonder if she's got an abscess brewing. You feel a pang of solidarity. You're all fighting the same battle against decay, inside and out. You're tempted to share your tooth powder, but it's running low, and you can't afford to be generous. Survival's a harsh teacher, and you're learning to hoard your resources, even when the kids' curious eyes tug at your guilt. As you finish, your gums are raw, your molar still throbbing, but your mouth feels marginally cleaner. You spit out the last of the powder, the chalky taste lingering, and wipe the twig on your sleeve, knowing it's not sterile. You pass a window where a neighbor's rinsing a pot, the same dirty water you used, and the sight's sobering. You're one of the lucky ones with your powder and twig, but even you can't escape the city's grip. The tenement's a breeding ground for rot, and every brush is a small act of defiance. You step outside the street's smoky haze, hitting you like a wall. You pass a vendor selling tooth powder that's probably just chalk dust, his pitch loud and desperate. The class divide's stark, wealthy folks have silver toothbrushes and private dentists, while you're stuck with a twig and a prayer. Your small arsenal's a lifeline, but it's not enough to outrun the city's filth. The tenement's behind you, but the weight of dental care lingers, a reminder that in this world, even your teeth are a battlefield. One gritty scrub at a time. You're still trudging through the grimy streets of Victorian London, the chalky aftertaste of tooth powder lingering in your mouth, a gritty reminder of your battle against decay. Your pocket's a small arsenal soap tooth, powder comb, rose water, and that greasy balm, but they're flimsy shields against the city's relentless filth, coal dust, sewage, and the sour reek of unwashed lives. Your boots are damp, your clothes stiff with grime, and your skin's tight under a layer of dirt despite your efforts. Now you're facing a new ordeal, keeping your bedding clean in a tenement where straw mattresses breed lice and mold faster than you can sweep. You're about to dive into the gritty reality of Victorian bedding hygiene, where a good night's sleep is a gamble with vermin and disease. You slip back into the tenement, the air heavy with damp and the faint ammonia stink of the courtyard cesspit. The room's a familiar mess, straw mattresses strewn across the floor, a wobbly table, and the family of 6, you share it with their coughs and chatter filling the space. Your mattress, a lumpy sack of straw, is your only refuge after long days, but it's a breeding ground for lice, fleas, and worse. You've got a rag, and that cloudy pump water you've learned to distrust, plus a borrowed brush to beat the straw. Cleaning this bedding feels like trying to polish a coal heap, but you're desperate for a night without itching. You drag the mattress to the courtyard, the straw rustling and shedding dust that makes you sneeze. The family's kids follow curious as you start beating the mattress with the brush, clouds of dust and tiny bugs flying out. You're reminded of that lice-combing nightmare, and your scalp itches just thinking about it. The straw's damp in spots, probably from the room's leaky walls, and it smells of mold and sweat. You splash some water on the worst patches, scrubbing with the rag, but the water's so dirty it's barely an improvement. You're fighting a losing battle, but a cleaner bed might mean one less sleepless night. Here's the mainstream fact. Bedding hygiene in Victorian slums was a nightmare. By the 1850s, most working-class families slept on straw mattresses or sacks shared by multiple people and rarely cleaned. Public health reports noted that these beds were hotspots for lice, fleas, and bed bugs spreading diseases like typhus and skin infections. Washing bedding was nearly impossible. Water was scarce. Soap was expensive, and drying space was non-existent. You're beating the mattress harder, your arms aching, and you're grateful for your rag, even if it's turning black with grime. The family's mattresses are in worse shape, and you know they're sleeping with the same bugs you're trying to evict. Now for the quirky tidbit. Some Victorians stuffed their mattresses with dried herbs like lavender or mint, believing it repelled bugs and purified the air. You're skeptical, imagining the smell of moldy lavender mixed with straw, and you're glad to stick with your brush, even if it's splintering. Historians still argue whether herbs worked or were just a placebo for a society desperate for clean sleep. Either way, you're not wasting coins on herbs when you can barely afford bread. The sensory assault's relentless. The courtyard's air is damp, reeking of sewage and smoke, and the mattress's dust stings your eyes, making them water. The brush's bristles scrape your hands already raw from scrubbing boots and floors, and the straw's moldy smell churns your stomach. The courtyard's alive with noise, kids shouting, a woman hauling water, and the creak of a cart nearby. Your clothes are heavy with damp, your boots muddy again, and your skin's itching under that greasy balm. Here's a Victorian joke to lighten the mood they called bed bugs night tenants, because they never paid rent, but stayed forever. You're not laughing, your mattress's crawling tenants are too real. Let's talk about the stakes. Dirty bedding wasn't just uncomfortable, it was deadly. Lice and fleas carried typhus, and damp straw bred mold that triggered respiratory issues. You've seen the family's grandmother coughing in the corner, and you know the mattress she sleeps on isn't helping. Cleaning's a small defense, but with tainted water and no proper tools, it's like bailing out a sinking ship. You're tempted to use your soap, but it's too precious, and the water's so filthy, it'd probably make things worse. You keep beating, hoping to shake out the worst of the bugs, but you know they'll be back by nightfall. Let's zoom out. Bedding hygiene was a microcosm of the Victorian sanitation crisis. Overcrowding meant families shared beds, passing bugs and diseases like a grim relay race. Public health reports from the 1860s described tenements where mattresses were alive with vermin and families too poor to replace them just endured. Reformers pushed for better housing, but change was slow, and you're stuck in the thick of it, beating a mattress that's more dirt than straw. Your brush and rag are pitiful weapons, but they're all you've got to keep the city's filth from stealing your sleep. Here's another oddity. Some Victorians believed sleeping on dirty bedding toughened you, like it built resistance to disease. You're tempted to scoff, staring at the bugs fleeing your mattress. But when clean bedding's a fantasy, maybe they had to believe something to cope. Your modern brain screaming for a washing machine and insecticide. But you're stuck in a world where hygiene's more hope than reality. You scrub a damp patch, hoping it dries before mold sets in, and try not to think about the typhus cases you've heard about in the market. You glance at the family's mother, airing out her own mattress, her face weary as she beats it with a stick. Her kids are scratching their skin dotted with flea bites, and you feel a pang of solidarity. You're all fighting the same unwinnable war. You're tempted to share your rag, but it's falling apart, and you need it for your own mattress. Survival's a harsh lesson, and you're learning to hoard your resources even when guilt tugs at you. The kids' curious eyes follow your brush, and you look away, focusing on your own small patch of straw. As you finish, the mattress is marginally cleaner, but it's a hollow victory. You drag it back inside the straw rustling and lay it on the floor, knowing the bugs will return. You pass a neighbor shaking out a blanket, the dust clouding around her, and the sight sobering. You're one of the lucky ones with your rag and brush, but even you can't escape the city's grip. The tenement's a breeding ground for vermin, and every night's a gamble with bites and disease. You step outside the courtyard's damp air, giving way to the street's smoky haze. You pass a vendor selling bedding herbs, his pitch loud and desperate, but you're skeptical. His sacks look moldy, just like your mattress. The class divides stark, wealthy folks have feather beds and maids to air them while you're stuck with straw and bugs. Your small arsenal's a lifeline, but it's not enough to outrun the city's filth. The tenement's behind you, but the weight of bedding hygiene lingers, a reminder that in this world, even sleep is a fight for survival, one dusty whack at a time. You're still slogging through the grimy streets of Victorian London, the faint itch of your straw mattress still crawling on your skin, a lingering reminder of those sleepless nights spent battling lice and fleas. Your pocket's a small fortress. Soap tooth, powder comb, rose water, and that greasy bomb, but they're flimsy defenses against the city's relentless filth. Coal dust, sewage, and the sour stench of unwashed lives. Your boots are damp, your clothes stiff with grime, and your mouth still gritty from that tooth powder. Now you're facing a new challenge, keeping your hair clean, in a world where lice are as common as cobblestones, and washing is a luxury that invites more dirt than it removes. You're about to dive into the gritty reality of Victorian hair care, where every comb stroke is a fight against vermin and grease. You duck into the tenement, the air thick with mold, and the ammonia reek of the courtyard cesspit. The room's a familiar chaos, straw, mattresses, a cluttered table, and the family of 6, you share it with their coughs and chatter filling the space. Your hair's a greasy mess, heavy with coal dust and sweat, and your scalp's itching again, despite that vinegar-soaked combing session days ago. You've got your comb and a bit of soap, but the only water's that cloudy pump sludge you've learned to dread. Cleaning your hair feels like trying to mop a floor during a flood, but you're desperate to stop the itch before lice take over again. You grab a chipped basin, fill it with pump water, and set it on the table. The family's kids watch their own hair, matted and crawling, as you dip your comb in the water and add a sliver of soap, hoping it'll cut through the grease. You start combing the soap, barely lathering, and the water turns gray with dirt almost instantly. Your scalp stings, and you're careful not to tug too hard, fearing you'll pull out more hair than lice. The kids giggle, but you're focused, checking each strand for those tiny pests that haunted your last wash. This isn't grooming, it's survival. Here's the mainstream fact. Hair care in Victorian slums was a grueling task, especially for the poor. By the 1850s, lice infestations were rampant due to overcrowding shared bedding and scarce water. Most people washed their hair, rarely using harsh soaps or vinegar, when they could afford it, and combs were often shared, spreading lice faster. Public health reports noted that head lice contributed to skin infections and typhus, with slum dwellers particularly vulnerable. You're combing harder, now your arm's aching, and you're grateful for your soap, even if it's dwindling. The family's mother, her hair tied in a rag, looks on with envy. She's got no soap to spare. Now, for the quirky tidbit, some Victorians used bacon fat to style their hair, believing it tamed flyaways and masked odors. You're horrified, imagining the smell of rancid grease mixed with coal dust, and you're thankful for your soap, harsh as it is. Historians still argue whether bacon fat was a practical fix. Its stickiness might have trapped dirt, or just another oddity born of desperation in a world with no proper products. Either way, you're sticking to your comb and soap, even if the water's turning your basin into a mud puddle. The sensory assault's relentless. The tenement's air is damp, smelling of straw and boiled potatoes, and the soapy water's gritty feel makes your skin crawl. The comb's teeth scrape your scalp, still tender from last time, and your hands are raw from scrubbing boots, floors, and now your hair. The room's alive with noise, kids bickering, the mother's cough, and the creak of floorboards. Your clothes are heavy with damp, your boots muddy, and your skin's itching under that greasy balm. Here's a Victorian joke to lighten the mood they called lice-head tenants, because they lived rent-free and never left. You're not laughing, your itching scalp's too real. Let's talk about the stakes. Lice weren't just a nuisance, they were a health hazard. Beyond causing relentless itching, they spread typhus, which could kill in weeks. You've seen people in the market scratching until their scalps bleed, and you're desperate to avoid that fate. Washing's a small defense, but the water's tainted, and the soap's so harsh it's drying your scalp to flakes. You rinse carefully, using as little water as possible, and comb again, checking for lice eggs. The family's kids, their hair unwashed for weeks, are a reminder of what happens when you let your guard down. Let's zoom out. Hair hygiene was a microcosm of the Victorian sanitation crisis. Overcrowding and lack of clean water made lice infestations inevitable, especially in slums where families shared combs and beds. Public health reports from the 1860s estimated that nearly every slum dweller had lice at some point, worsened by malnutrition and poor hygiene. Reformers pushed for better sanitation, but combs and soap were luxuries, and you're one of the lucky ones with your small arsenal. Still, you're fighting a city that's winning your scalp, itching as the grime creeps back. Here's another oddity. Some Victorians believed cutting hair during a full moon prevented lice, thinking lunar cycles affected body humors. You're tempted to scoff, combing through your greasy strands, but when lice are a daily threat, maybe any belief helps. Your modern brain's screaming for shampoo and hot water, but you're stuck in a world where hair care's more superstition than science. You keep combing, hoping to evict the pests, and try not to think about the typhus cases you've heard about in the tenement. You glance at the family's mother, her hair still tied up her hands, busy mending a shirt. She's scratching her scalp, and you wonder if she's fighting the same lice you are. You feel a pang of solidarity. You're all battling the same vermin inside and out. You're tempted to share your soap, but it's nearly gone, and you can't afford to be generous. Survival's a harsh teacher, and you're learning to hoard your resources even when the kid's matted hair tugs at your guilt. You focus on your own scalp, combing until your arms burn. As you finish, your hair's marginally cleaner, but it's a hollow victory. You dump the gray water into the courtyard, cesspit, the basin now streaked with grime, and wipe the comb on your sleeve, knowing it's not sterile. You pass a neighbor combing her child's hair with her fingers, no soap or water in sight, and the sight's sobering. You're one of the lucky ones with your comb and soap, but even you can't escape the city's grip. The tenement's a lice nursery, and every comb strokes a small act of defiance. You step outside the street, smoky haze hitting you like a wall. You pass a vendor selling lice powder, his pitch loud and desperate, but you're skeptical. His jars look like they're filled with chalk dust. The class divides stark, wealthy folks have maids to comb their hair and private washrooms, while you're stuck with a twig and a prayer. Your small arsenal's a lifeline, but it's not enough to outrun the city's filth. The tenements behind you, but the weight of hair hygiene lingers, a reminder that in this world, even your scalp's a battlefield, one itchy stroke at a time. You're still trudging through the grimy streets of Victorian London, the itch of your freshly combed scalp, a nagging reminder of the lice you're barely keeping at bay. Your pocket's a small arsenal soap tooth, powder comb, rose water, and that greasy balm, but they're flimsy shields against the city's relentless filth, coal dust sewage, and the sour stench of unwashed lives. Your boots are damp, your clothes stiff with grime, and your hair's already collecting dust despite your efforts. Now you're facing a new challenge, keeping your body warm in a damp, unheated tenement, where cold seeps into your bones, weakening your defenses against disease. You're about to dive into the gritty reality of Victorian warmth, where staying dry and warm is a battle for survival in a city that's as chilling as it is filthy. You slip back into the tenement, the air heavy with damp, and the faint ammonia reek of the courtyard cesspit. The room's a familiar chaos, straw mattresses, a cluttered table, and the family of 6, you share it with their coughs and chatter filling the space. The walls are slick with moisture, and the single window cracked, and drafty lets in a biting chill. Your clothes are damp from the street's mist, and your boots, still soggy from cleaning, offer no warmth. You've got a tattered blanket, a gift from a neighbor, and a small fire in the hearth, but coal's expensive, and the family's ration is dwindling. Keeping warm feels like trying to hold water in a sieve, but you're desperate to avoid the shivers that invite illness. You huddle near the fire, its weak flames barely cutting the chill, and wrap the blanket tighter. The family's kids are curled up on their mattress, sharing a single blanket, their faces pale and noses running. You rub your hands together, trying to coax warmth into your fingers, and notice the damp creeping up your sleeves. You've heard of slum fever, a catch-all for the illnesses that thrive in cold, damp conditions, and you're determined to stay warm enough to keep it at bay. You add a precious lump of coal to the fire, the smoke stinging your eyes, and pray it lasts the night. Here's the mainstream fact: staying warm in Victorian slums was a constant struggle, especially in winter. By the 1850s, most tenements lacked proper heating, with families relying on small hearths or braziers fueled by coal or scavenged wood. Public health reports noted that cold, damp conditions worsened respiratory diseases like tuberculosis and bronchitis, which killed thousands in slums annually. You're stoking the fire, your hands gritty with coal dust, and you're grateful for the blanket even if it's threadbare. The family's grandmother coughing in the corner is a reminder of what happens when the cold wins. Now for the quirky tidbit: some Victorians stuffed their clothes with newspaper to trap heat, calling it poor man's wool. You're tempted to try, but the thought of crinkling paper against your skin, already itching from grime, isn't appealing. Historians still argue whether this was a clever insulation trick or just desperation in a world where fuel and warm clothes were luxuries. Either way, you're sticking to your blanket and the fire, even if the smoke's making your throat raw. The sensory assault's relentless. The tenement's air is damp, smelling of mold and burnt coal, and the fire's weak heat barely reaches your feet. The blanket's rough, scratching your neck, and your hands are blackened from the coal stinging under that greasy balm. The room's alive with noise, kids sniffling the mother, muttering about the cold and the creak of floorboards. Your clothes are heavy with damp, your boots soggy, and your scalp's itching again, despite your recent combing. Here's a Victorian joke to lighten the mood they called a cold tenement, a bone chiller, because it froze you to your marrow. You're not laughing, your shivering body's proof enough. Let's talk about the stakes. Cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it was deadly. Damp, unheated homes bred mold and weakened immune systems, making slum dwellers easy prey for pneumonia and consumption. You've seen neighbors wrapped in rags, their faces gaunt from illness, and you know the cold's as much a killer as tainted water. Keeping the fire going's a small defense, but coal's pricey and the damp's relentless, seeping into your clothes and bones. You're tempted to burn some straw from the mattress, but that'd mean more bugs and less sleep, so you stick to the coal rationing it like gold. Let's zoom out. Heating was a microcosm of the Victorian sanitation crisis. The Industrial Revolution packed millions into cities, but tenements were built cheap with thin walls and no insulation. Public health reports from the 1860s described slums where families burned anything rags, furniture to stay warm, often choking on smoke in the process. Reformers pushed for better housing, but change was slow, and you're stuck in the thick of it, huddled by a fire that's more smoke than heat. Your blanket and coal are pitiful weapons, but they're all you've got to keep the city's chill from claiming you. Here's another oddity. Some Victorians believed sitting by an open window, even in winter, cleansed the lungs with fresh air. You're tempted to scoff, feeling the draft cut through your blanket, but when the room's air is thick with mold, maybe any breeze seems like a cure. Your modern brain's screaming for central heating, but you're stuck in a world where warmth's more hope than reality. You stoke the fire hoping it holds, and try not to think about the tuberculosis cases you've heard about in the tenement. You glance at the family, their kids shivering under their thin blanket, the mother rubbing her hands near the fire. She's coughing just like her mother, and you wonder if the cold's already got its claws in them. You feel a pang of solidarity. You're all fighting the same battle against the chill inside and out. You're tempted to share your coal, but it's nearly gone, and you can't afford to be generous. Survival's a harsh teacher, and you're learning to hoard your resources even when the kids' chattering teeth tug at your guilt. You focus on the fire, coaxing it to burn brighter. As you settle by the hearth, the weak warmth barely reaches your toes, but it's a small victory. You tuck the blanket around your shoulders, the smoke making your eyes water, and try to dry your boots by the fire, knowing they'll still be damp by morning. You pass a neighbor hauling a sack of scavenged wood, her face red from the cold, and the sight sobering. You're one of the lucky ones with your blanket and coal, but even you can't escape the city's grip. The tenement's a freezer, and every spark's a small act of defiance. You step outside briefly, the street's icy haze hitting you like a slap. You pass a vendor selling warming tonics, his bottles filled with who knows what, his pitch loud and desperate. You're skeptical, they're probably just alcohol, and you need real warmth, not a fleeting burn. The class divide's stark wealthy folks have fireplaces and fur-lined coats, while you're stuck with a threadbare blanket and a dying fire. Your small arsenal's a lifeline, but it's not enough to outrun the city's chill. The tenement's behind you, but the weight of staying warm lingers, a reminder that in this world, even heat is a fight for survival, one smoky ember at a time. You're still trudging through the grimy streets of Victorian London, the faint warmth from that meager tenement fire already a fading memory as the city's damp chill seeps back into your bones. Your pocket's a small arsenal soap tooth, powder comb, rose water, and that greasy balm, but they're flimsy defenses against the relentless filth, coal dust sewage, and the sour stench of unwashed lives. Your boots are still soggy, your clothes stiff with grime, and your hair's greasy despite your recent combing. Now you're facing a new challenge, keeping your hands clean, in a world where every touch store handles market goods, or even your own food carries the city's dirt and disease. You're about to dive into the gritty reality of Victorian hand hygiene, where clean hands are a fleeting victory in a battle against invisible killers. You slip back into the tenement, the air thick with mold and the ammonia reek of the courtyard cesspit. The room's a familiar chaos. Straw mattresses, a cluttered table, and the family of 6, you share it with their coughs and chatter filling the space. Your hands are blackened from coal, gritty from sweeping, and sticky from handling food, and you're hyper-aware of the germs you can't see but know are there. You've got your precious soap, but the only water's that cloudy pump sludge you've come to dread. Washing your hands feels like a ritual of hope, but you're desperate to scrub away the filth before it settles deeper. You grab a chipped basin, fill it with pump water, and set it on the table. The family's kids watch their own hands crusted with dirt as you shave a sliver of soap into the water, watching it barely lather in the murky liquid. You scrub the soap, stinging your raw knuckles, and the water turns gray, almost instantly flecked with coal dust and grime. Your hands are still sore from beating that mattress, and the cold water bites, but you're determined to keep them clean. You've seen people in the market with infected cuts, their fingers swollen and oozing, and you're not eager to join them. Here's the mainstream fact. Hand hygiene in Victorian slums was nearly non-existent, contributing to widespread disease. By the 1850s, most people washed their hands rarely, if at all, due to scarce water and soap. Public health reports noted that dirty hands spread cholera, typhoid, and skin infections, especially in overcrowded tenements, where families shared everything from food to bedding. You're scrubbing harder, your skin's stinging, and you're grateful for your soap, even if it's dwindling. The family's mother, her hands cracked from work, looks on with envy. She's got no soap to spare, and her kids' hands are black with grime. Now, for the quirky tidbit, some Victorians used sand or ash to clean their hands, believing it scoured dirt better than water. You're horrified, imagining the gritty mess caked under your nails, and you're thankful for your soap, harsh as it is. Historians still argue whether this was a practical substitute, ash might absorb grease, or just desperation in a world where soap was a luxury. Either way, you're sticking to your soap and water, even if the basin's contents look like mud by the time you're done. The sensory assault's relentless. The tenement's air is damp, smelling of straw and boiled cabbage, and the soapy water's gritty feel makes your skin crawl. The soap's harsh bite stings your knuckles already raw from scrubbing boots, floors, and hair. The room's alive with noise, kids bickering, the mother's cough, and the creak of floorboards. Your clothes are heavy with damp, your boots soggy, and your scalp's itching despite your recent combing. Here's a Victorian joke to lighten the mood they called dirty hands, slum gloves because they coated everyone in the tenements. You're not laughing. Your stinging hands are proof enough. Let's talk about the stakes. Dirty hands weren't just unsightly, they were deadly. Germs on unwashed hands spread disease through food water and touch with cholera and typhoid, claiming thousands in slums. You've seen market vendors handling bread with filthy fingers, and you know the water you're using to wash isn't much safer. Scrubbing's a small defense, but the soap's harsh and the water's tainted, so every wash is a gamble. You rinse carefully, using as little water as possible, and dry your hands on your sleeve, hoping you've done more good than harm. Let's zoom out. Hand hygiene was a microcosm of the Victorian sanitation crisis. The Industrial Revolution packed millions into cities, but clean water and soap were luxuries, leaving most to live with filth. Public health reports from the 1860s described slums where families shared basins, spreading germs faster than they could be washed away. Reformers like Florence Nightingale pushed for better hygiene, but change was slow, and you're stuck in the thick of it, scrubbing hands that'll be dirty again by the time you eat. Your soap's a small weapon, but it's no match for the city's relentless grime. Here's another oddity. Some Victorians believed washing hands too often weakened them, stripping natural oils that protected against disease. You're tempted to scoff, staring at your raw red knuckles. But when soap's scarce and water's dirty, maybe they had to believe something to cope. Your modern brain's screaming for hand sanitizer, but you're stuck in a world where hygiene's more ritual than science. You keep scrubbing, hoping to avoid the infections you've seen on others' hands, and try not to think about the cholera cases whispered about in the market. You glance at the family, their kids eating bread, with hands black from playing in the courtyard. The mother's wiping her hands on her apron, no soap in sight, and you wonder if she's fighting the same germs you are. You feel a pang of solidarity. You're all battling the same filth inside and out. You're tempted to share your soap, but it's nearly gone, and you can't afford to be generous. Survival's a harsh teacher, and you're learning to hoard your resources, even when the kids' dirty fingers tug at your guilt. You focus on your own hands, scrubbing until they're raw. As you finish, your hands are marginally cleaner, but it's a hollow victory. You dump the gray water into the courtyard cesspit, the basin streaked with grime, and wipe your hands on your sleeve, knowing it's not sterile. You pass a neighbor washing dishes in the same dirty water, her hands cracked and red, and the sight sobering. You're one of the lucky ones with your soap and basin, but even you can't escape the city's grip. The tenement's a germ factory, and every scrub's a small act of defiance. You step outside the street, smoky haze hitting you like a wall. You pass a vendor selling cleansing powders, his pitch loud and desperate. But you're skeptical. His jars look like they're filled with ash. The class divide's stark. Wealthy folks have servants to wash their hands and private pumps, while you're stuck with a sliver of soap and a prayer. Your small arsenal's a lifeline, but it's not enough to outrun the city's filth. The tenement's behind you, but the weight of hand hygiene lingers, a reminder that in this world, even clean hands are a fight for survival, one stinging scrub at a time. You're still slogging through the grimy streets of Victorian London, the sting of soap on your raw hands, a sharp reminder of your endless fight against the city's filth. Your pocket's a small fortress. Soap tooth, powder comb, rose water, and that greasy balm. But they're flimsy defenses against the relentless assault of coal dust, sewage, and the sour stench of unwashed lives. Your boots are soggy, your clothes stiff with grime, and your scalp itches despite your recent combing. Now you're facing a new challenge, keeping your eyes clear in a city where smoke, dust, and grime cloud your vision and invite infection. You're about to dive into the gritty reality of Victorian eye hygiene, where every blink is a battle against irritation and disease. You slip back into the tenement, the air thick with mold, and the ammonia reek of the courtyard cesspit. The room's a familiar chaos: straw, mattresses, a cluttered table, and the family of 6. You share it with their coughs and chatter filling the space. Your eyes are stinging gritty from the coal smoke that blankets the city, and you've noticed a redness that worries you. You've seen people in the market with weepy, crusted eyes, and you're desperate to avoid that fate. You've got a clean rag, a rare find, and that cloudy pump water you've learned to distrust. Cleaning your eyes feels like a delicate dance, but you're determined to keep your vision clear. You set the basin on the table, filling it with a small amount of pump water, hoping it's not as dirty as it looks. The family's kids watch their own eyes red from smoke and rubbing as you dampen the rag and gently dab at your eyes. The water's cold, and the rag's texture is rough, but you're careful knowing one wrong move could push dirt deeper. Your eyes burn, and you're hyper-aware of the germs in the water, but you've got no other option. You rinse the rag repeatedly, trying to keep it clean, and dab again, hoping to soothe the irritation without inviting infection. Here's the mainstream fact. Eye infections were rampant in Victorian slums, fueled by poor hygiene and constant exposure to smoke and dust. By the 1850s, public health reports noted that conjunctivitis and trachoma were common, especially among the poor who lacked clean water to wash their faces. Smoke from coal fires and industrial chimneys irritated eyes, and dirty hands spread bacteria, leading to painful, sometimes blinding infections. You're dabbing carefully, your hand still raw from scrubbing, and you're grateful for your rag, even if it's not sterile. The family's grandmother squinting in the corner, her eyes crusted, is a reminder of what's at stake. Now for the quirky tidbit. Some Victorians used tea-soaked rags to soothe their eyes, believing the tannins reduced inflammation. You're skeptical, imagining the sticky mess of tea leaves in this already filthy room, and you're thankful for your plain rag, rough as it is. Historians still argue whether tea was effective or just a folk remedy born of desperation in a world with no proper eye care. Either way, you're sticking to your rag and water, even if the basin's contents look like sludge by the time you're done. The sensory assault's relentless. The tenement's air is damp, smelling of straw and burnt coal, and the cold water stings your eyes, making them water more. The rag's rough weave scrapes your eyelids, and your hands still sore from scrubbing everything from boots to hair tremble slightly. The room's alive with noise, kids sniffling the mother's cough and the creak of floorboards. Your clothes are heavy with damp, your boots soggy, and your scalp's itching under that greasy balm. Here's a Victorian joke to lighten the mood they called Red Eyes Slum Lanterns, because they glowed in the dark of the tenements. You're not laughing, your stinging eyes are too real. Let's talk about the stakes. Eye infections weren't just painful, they could be catastrophic. Trachoma spread by dirty hands and shared rags could scar the cornea, leading to blindness. You've seen street vendors with clouded eyes, their livelihoods crumbling, and you know a simple infection could ruin you. Washing's a small defense, but the water's tainted, and the rag's barely clean, so every dab is a gamble. You rinse, carefully blinking to clear the grit, and dry your face on your sleeve, hoping you've done more good than harm. Let's zoom out. Eye hygiene was a microcosm of the Victorian sanitation crisis. Overcrowding, poor ventilation, and lack of clean water made infections inevitable, especially in slums, where families shared everything from basins to bedding. Public health reports from the 1860s estimated that eye diseases affected a significant portion of slum dwellers, worsened by malnutrition and constant exposure to irritants. Reformers pushed for better sanitation, but clean water and rags were luxuries, and you're one of the lucky ones with your small arsenal. Still, you're fighting a city that's winning your eyes stinging as the smoke creeps back. Here's another oddity. Some Victorians believed staring at green cloth or grass rested the eyes, countering the effects of smoke. You're tempted to scoff, blinking through the sting. But when every day's a haze of coal dust, maybe any remedy feels like hope. Your modern brain's screaming for eye drops and sunglasses, but you're stuck in a world where eye care's more superstition than science. You keep dabbing, hoping to avoid the crusty infections you've seen, and try not to think about the blindness stories whispered about in the market. You glance at the family, their kids rubbing their eyes with dirty fists, spreading who knows what. The mother's wiping her face with her apron, no rag in sight, and you wonder if she's fighting the same infections you are. You feel a pang of solidarity. You're all battling the same filth inside and out. You're tempted to share your rag, but it's already fraying, and you can't afford to lose it. Survival's a harsh teacher, and you're learning to hoard your resources, even when the kids' red eyes tug at your guilt. You focus on your own face, dabbing until your eyelids burn. As you finish, your eyes are marginally clearer, but it's a hollow victory. You dump the gray water into the courtyard cesspit, the basin streaked with grime, and tuck the rag into your pocket, knowing it's not clean. You pass a neighbor splashing her face with pump water, her eyes red and swollen, and the sight sobering. You're one of the lucky ones with your rag and soap, but even you can't escape the city's grip. The tenement's a breeding ground for infection, and every dab's a small act of defiance. You step outside the street, smoky haze hitting your eyes like a slap. You pass a vendor selling eye tonics, his bottles filled with dubious liquid, his pitch loud and desperate. You're skeptical. They're probably just watered-down vinegar, and you need real relief, not a scam. The class divide's stark. Wealthy folks have private doctors and clean wash basins, while you're stuck with a rag and a prayer. Your small arsenal's a lifeline, but it's not enough to outrun the city's filth. The tenement's behind you, but the weight of eye hygiene lingers, a reminder that in this world, even seeing clearly is a fight for survival, one stinging dab at a time. You're still trudging through the grimy streets of Victorian London, the sting in your eyes, a nagging reminder of the coal smoke and dust you're barely keeping at bay. Your pocket's a small fortress. Soap tooth, powder comb, rose water, and that greasy balm, but they're flimsy defenses against the city's relentless filth, coal dust sewage, and the sour stench of unwashed lives. Your boots are soggy, your clothes stiff with grime, and your scalp itches despite your recent combing. Now you're facing a new challenge, keeping your nails clean, in a world where every task, scrubbing, sweeping, or eating, packs dirt under them, inviting infection. You're about to dive into the gritty reality of Victorian nail hygiene, where clean nails are a fleeting victory in a battle against disease and decay. You slip back into the tenement, the air thick with mold, and the ammonia reek of the courtyard cesspit. The room's a familiar chaos, straw mattresses, a cluttered table, and the family of 6, you share it with their coughs and chatter filling the space. Your nails are black with coal dust, gritty from scrubbing boots and floors, and crusted with food from your last meal. You've seen people in the market with swollen, infected cuticles, and you're desperate to avoid that fate. You've got your soap and a small knife to scrape under your nails, but the only water's that cloudy pump sludge you've come to dread. Cleaning your nails feels like a surgical procedure, but you're determined to keep infection at bay. You set a chipped basin on the table, filling it with a small amount of pump water, its murkiness making you wince. The family's kids watch their own nails jagged and filthy as you shave a sliver of soap into the water and dip your fingers in, letting them soak briefly. You start scraping under your nails with the knife, careful not to nick the skin, but the dirt's stubborn, lodged deep from days of grime. Your hands are raw from scrubbing everything from hair to bedding, and the cold water bites. But you're focused, knowing a small cut could fester in this filthy world. You rinse and scrub again, the water turning black with coal dust and dirt. Here's the mainstream fact. Nail hygiene in Victorian slums was largely ignored, contributing to widespread infections. By the 1850s, public health reports noted that dirty nails spread bacteria, leading to skin infections, abscesses, and even sepsis in severe cases. Soap and clean water were luxuries, and most people trimmed their nails with knives or scissors, often shared, which spread germs further. You're scraping carefully, your knuckles stinging, and you're grateful for your soap, even if it's dwindling. The family's mother, her nails broken, and Black looks on with a mix of curiosity and envy. She's got no soap to spare, and her kids' nails are caked with grime. Now for the quirky tidbit. Some Victorians used lemon juice to clean their nails, believing its acidity dissolved dirt and whitened them. You're skeptical, imagining the sting of lemon on your raw cuticles, and you're thankful for your soap, harsh as it is. Historians still argue whether lemon juice was effective or just a folk remedy born of desperation in a world with no proper hygiene products. Either way, you're sticking to your soap and knife, even if the basin's contents look like sludge by the time you're done. The sensory assault's relentless. The tenement's air is damp, smelling of straw and burnt coal, and the soapy water's gritty feel makes your skin crawl. The soap's harsh bite stings your cuticles already sore from scrubbing boots, floors, and hair. The room's alive with noise, kids bickering, the mother's cough, and the creak of floorboards. Your clothes are heavy with damp, your boots soggy, and your scalp's itching under that greasy balm. Here's a Victorian joke to lighten the mood. They called dirty nails slum rings because they framed every finger in filth. You're not laughing, your stinging cuticles are too real. Let's talk about the stakes. Dirty nails weren't just unsightly, they were dangerous. Bacteria under nails spread disease through food water and touch with infections like paronychia or abscesses common in slums. You've seen market vendors with swollen fingers, their nails pus-filled, and you know a simple infection could sideline you for weeks. Scrubbing's a small defense, but the water's tainted and the soap's abrasive, so every scrape is a gamble. You rinse carefully, checking for cuts, and dry your hands on your sleeve, hoping you've done more good than harm. Let's zoom out. Nail hygiene was a microcosm of the Victorian sanitation crisis. Overcrowding, poor water quality, and lack of soap made cleanliness nearly impossible, especially in slums where families shared tools and basins. Public health reports from the 1860s described workers whose infected nails led to lost wages or even amputation in extreme cases, worsened by malnutrition and exposure to filth. Reformers pushed for better hygiene education, but soap and clean water were luxuries, and you're one of the lucky ones with your small arsenal. Still, you're fighting a city that's winning your nails gritty as the grime creeps back. Here's another oddity. Some Victorians believed long nails trapped evil spirits, so they cut them short with blunt knives, often causing more harm than good. You're tempted to scoff scraping carefully with your knife, but when infections are a daily threat, maybe any belief helps. Your modern brain's screaming for nail clippers and antiseptic, but you're stuck in a world where hygiene's more ritual than science. You keep scraping, hoping to avoid the swollen infections you've seen, and try not to think about the sepsis stories whispered about in the market. You glance at the family, their kids picking at their nails with dirty fingers spreading who knows what. The mother's trimming her nails with a rusty blade, no soap in sight, and you wonder if she's fighting the same germs you are. You feel a pang of solidarity. You're all battling the same filth inside and out. You're tempted to share your soap, but it's nearly gone, and you can't afford to be generous. Survival's a harsh teacher, and you're learning to hoard your resources even when the kids' jagged nails tug at your guilt. You focus on your own hands scraping until your cuticles burn. As you finish, your nails are marginally cleaner, but it's a hollow victory. You dump the black water into the courtyard cesspit, the basin streaked with grime, and tuck the knife into your pocket, knowing it's not sterile. You pass a neighbor scrubbing her hands with ash, her nails black and broken, and the sight sobering. You're one of the lucky ones with your soap and knife, but even you can't escape the city's grip. The tenement's a germ factory, and every scrape's a small act of defiance. You step outside the street's smoky haze hitting you like a wall. You pass a vendor selling nail cleaners, his pitch loud and desperate, but you're skeptical. His powders look like chalk dust. The class divide's stark, wealthy folks have manicure kits and servants to clean their hands while you're stuck with a knife and a prayer. Your small arsenal's a lifeline, but it's not enough to outrun the city's filth. The tenement's behind you, but the weight of nail hygiene lingers, a reminder that in this world, even clean nails are a fight for survival. One gritty scrape at a time, you're still trudging through the grimy streets of Victorian London, the sting of soap under your nails, a sharp reminder of your endless fight against the city's filth. Your pocket's a small fortress. Soap tooth, powder comb, rose water, and that greasy balm, but they're flimsy shields against the relentless assault of coal dust, sewage, and the sour stench of unwashed lives. Your boots are soggy, your clothes stiff with grime, and your scalp itches despite your recent combing. Now you're facing a new challenge, keeping your ears clean in a world where dust wax and grime build up, inviting infection and discomfort. You're about to dive into the gritty reality of Victorian ear hygiene, where every swab is a delicate battle against dirt and disease. You slip back into the tenement, the air thick with mold and the ammonia reek of the courtyard cesspit. The room's a familiar chaos. Straw mattresses, a cluttered table, and the family of 6, you share it with their coughs and chatter filling the space. Your ears feel clogged, gritty from the city's smoke and dust, and you've noticed a faint ache that worries you. You've seen people in the market rubbing their ears, wincing with pain, and you're desperate to avoid an infection that could deafen you. you've got a clean rag, a rare treasure, and that cloudy pump water you've learned to distrust. Cleaning your ears feels like a risky procedure, but you're determined to keep them clear. You set the chipped basin on the table, filling it with a small amount of pump water, its murkiness making you grimace. The family's kids watch their own ears crusted with dirt as you dampen the rag and add a sliver of soap, hoping it'll cut through the grime. You gently swab the outer ear, careful not to push dirt deeper. But the water's cold, and the rag's rough texture scrapes your skin. Your hands are raw from scrubbing nails, boots, and floors, and you're hyper-aware of the germs in the water, but it's your only option. You rinse the rag repeatedly, trying to keep it clean, and swab again, hoping to ease the ache without inviting worse. Here's the mainstream fact. Ear hygiene in Victorian slums was largely neglected, contributing to infections and hearing loss. By the 1850s, public health reports noted that ear infections often caused by bacteria in dirty water or hands were common, especially among the poor exposed to constant smoke and dust. Earwax buildup mixed with grime could lead to painful abscesses or chronic issues like otitis media. You're swabbing carefully, your fingers trembling, and you're grateful for your soap even if it's dwindling. The family's grandmother rubbing her ear with a grimace is a reminder of what's at stake. She's half deaf, likely from years of neglect. Now, for the quirky tidbit, some Victorians used olive oil to soften earwax, believing it flushed out dirt naturally. You're skeptical, imagining the sticky mess of oil in this filthy room, and you're thankful for your soap and rag, harsh as they are. Historians still argue whether olive oil was effective or just a folk remedy born of desperation in a world with no proper ear care. Either way, you're sticking to your rag and water, even if the basin's contents look like sludge by the time you're done. The sensory assault's relentless. The tenement's air is damp, smelling of straw and burnt coal, and the soapy water's gritty feel makes your skin crawl. The soap's harsh bite stings your ear's delicate skin, and your hands sore from scrubbing everything from hair to nails ache with every move. The room's alive with noise, kids bickering, the mother's cough, and the creak of floorboards, making your ears strain even more. Your clothes are heavy with damp, your boots soggy, and your scalp's itching under that greasy balm. Here's a Victorian joke to lighten the mood they called clogged ears slum mufflers, because they blocked out the city's din. You're not laughing, your aching ears are too real. Let's talk about the stakes. Ear infections weren't just painful, they could be devastating. Untreated, they led to hearing loss, or in rare cases, spread to the brain, causing fatal complications. You've seen street vendors wincing, their ears oozing, and you know a simple infection could rob you of sound and livelihood. Swabbing's a small defense, but the water's tainted and the rag's barely clean, so every wipe is a gamble. You rinse carefully, tilting your head to drain water, and dry your ears with your sleeve, hoping you've done more good than harm. Let's zoom out. Ear hygiene was a microcosm of the Victorian sanitation crisis. Overcrowding, poor ventilation, and lack of clean water made infections inevitable, especially in slums where families shared rags and basins. Public health reports from the 1860s described workers losing hearing from untreated infections, worsened by constant exposure to smoke and grime. Reformers pushed for better hygiene, but soap and clean water were luxuries, and you're one of the lucky ones with your small arsenal. Still, you're fighting a city that's winning your ears aching as the dust creeps back. Here's another oddity. Some Victorians believed earwax was a natural protector, refusing to clean their ears for fear of upsetting the body's balance. You're tempted to scoff, swabbing carefully through the grit. But when medical knowledge is scarce, maybe any belief helps. Your modern brain's screaming for cotton swabs and antiseptic, but you're stuck in a world where ear care's more guesswork than science. You keep swabbing, hoping to avoid the oozing infections you've seen, and try not to think about the deafness stories whispered about in the market. You glance at the family, their kids scratching their ears with dirty fingers, spreading who knows what. The mother's cleaning a pot with the same dirty water you're using, and you wonder if her ears are as clogged as yours. You feel a pang of solidarity. You're all battling the same filth inside and out. You're tempted to share your rag, but it's already fraying, and you can't afford to lose it. Survival's a harsh teacher, and you're learning to hoard your resources even when the kids' red ears tug at your guilt. You focus on your own ears, swabbing until they burn. As you finish, your ears are marginally clearer, but it's a hollow victory. You dump the black water into the courtyard cesspit, the basin streaked with grime, and tuck the rag into your pocket, knowing it's not sterile. You pass a neighbor rubbing her ears with her apron, her face wincing and the sight sobering. You're one of the lucky ones with your soap and rag, but even you can't escape the city's grip. The tenement's a germ factory, and every swab's a small act of defiance. You step outside the street's smoky haze, hitting your eyes and ears like a slap. You pass a vendor selling eardrops, his bottles filled with dubious liquid, his pitch loud and desperate. You're skeptical. They're probably just watered-down oil, and you need real relief, not a scam. The class divide's stark. Wealthy folks have private doctors and clean wash basins, while you're stuck with a rag and a prayer. Your small arsenal's a lifeline, but it's not enough to outrun the city's filth. The tenement's behind you, but the weight of ear hygiene lingers, a reminder that in this world, even hearing clearly is a fight for survival, one stinging swab at a time. You're still slogging through the grimy streets of Victorian London, the faint ache in your ears, a nagging reminder of the dust and smoke you're barely keeping at bay. Your pocket's a small fortress. Soap tooth, powder comb, rose water, and that greasy balm, but they're flimsy shields against the city's relentless filth, coal dust sewage, and the sour stench of unwashed lives. Your boots are soggy, your clothes stiff with grime, and your scalp itches despite your recent combing. Now you're facing a new challenge, keeping your nose clean in a world where every breath draws in smoke dust and the stench of decay, risking infection and irritation. You're about to dive into the gritty reality of Victorian nasal hygiene, where every sniff is a battle against the city's toxic air. You slip back into the tenement, the air thick with mold and the ammonia reek of the courtyard cesspit. The room's a familiar chaos, straw mattresses, a cluttered table, and the family of 6, you share it with their coughs and chatter filling the space. Your nose feels clogged, irritated by the coal smoke and market dust, and you've noticed a faint soreness that worries you. You've seen people in the streets, sneezing, their noses crusted with grime, and you're desperate to avoid a sinus infection that could worsen in this filthy world. You've got a clean rag, a rare treasure, and that cloudy pump water you've learned to distrust. Cleaning your nose feels like a delicate task, but you're determined to keep your breathing clear. You set the chipped basin on the table, filling it with a small amount of pump water, its murkiness making you grimace. The family's kids watch their own noses running with dirt-streaked mucus as you dampen the rag and add a sliver of soap, hoping it'll cut through the grime. You gently wipe the edges of your nostrils, careful not to push dirt deeper. But the water's cold, and the rag's rough texture scrapes your skin. Your hands are raw from scrubbing nails, boots, and ears, and you're hyper-aware of the germs in the water, but it's your only option. You rinse the rag repeatedly, trying to keep it clean, and wipe again, hoping to ease the soreness without inviting worse. Here's the mainstream fact: nasal infections were common in Victorian slums, fueled by constant exposure to smoke dust and poor sanitation. By the 1850s, public health reports noted that sinus infections and respiratory issues worsened by inhaling coal smoke and street filth were rampant, especially among the poor. Dirty hands and shared rags spread bacteria, leading to chronic congestion, or worse. You're wiping carefully, your fingers trembling, and you're grateful for your soap, even if it's dwindling. The family's grandmother sneezing in the corner, her nose red and swollen, is a reminder of what's at stake. She's been coughing for weeks, likely from the same air you're breathing. Now, for the quirky tidbit, some Victorians used salt water to rinse their noses, believing it cleansed the passages and fought miasmas. You're skeptical, imagining the sting of salt in your irritated nose, and you're thankful for your soap and rag, harsh as they are. Historians still argue whether salt water was effective or just a folk remedy born of desperation in a world with no proper nasal care. Either way, you're sticking to your rag and water, even if the basin's contents look like sludge by the time you're done. The sensory assault's relentless. The tenement's air is damp, smelling of straw and burnt coal, and the soapy water's gritty feel makes your skin crawl. The soap's harsh bite stings your nostrils' delicate skin, and your hands sore from scrubbing everything from hair to ears, ache with every move. The room's alive with noise, kids sniffling the mother's cough, and the creak of floorboards, making your clogged nose strain even more. Your clothes are heavy with damp, your boots soggy, and your scalp's itching under that greasy balm. Here's a Victorian joke to lighten the mood. They called a stuffy nose a slum filter because it trapped the city's filth. You're not laughing, your sore nose is too real. Let's talk about the stakes. Nasal infections weren't just uncomfortable, they could escalate. Sinus infections spread by dirty hands, and tainted water could lead to chronic respiratory issues, or in rare cases, spread to the brain. You've seen market vendors sneezing their noses, oozing, and you know a simple infection could weaken you further in this harsh world. Wiping's a small defense, but the water's tainted and the rag's barely clean, so every swab is a gamble. You rinse, carefully breathing shallowly to avoid inhaling water, and dry your face with your sleeve, hoping you've done more good than harm. Let's zoom out. Nasal hygiene was a microcosm of the Victorian sanitation crisis. Overcrowding, poor ventilation, and lack of clean water made infections inevitable, especially in slums, where families shared rags and basins. Public health reports from the 1860s described workers suffering from chronic sinus issues worsened by constant exposure to smoke and grime. Reformers pushed for better sanitation, but soap and clean water were luxuries, and you're one of the lucky ones with your small arsenal. Still, you're fighting a city that's winning your nose sore as the dust creeps back. Here's another oddity. Some Victorians believed inhaling vinegar fumes purified the nose, warding off disease-carrying miasmas. You're tempted to scoff, wiping carefully through the sting. But when every breath's a cloud of smoke, maybe any remedy feels like hope. Your modern brain's screaming for nasal spray and air filters, but you're stuck in a world where hygiene's more superstition than science. You keep wiping, hoping to avoid the oozing infections you've seen, and try not to think about the sinus fever stories whispered about in the market. You glance at the family, their kids wiping their noses with dirty sleeves, spreading who knows what. The mother's cleaning a pot with the same dirty water you're using, and you wonder if her nose is as clogged as yours. You feel a pang of solidarity. You're all battling the same filth inside and out. You're tempted to share your rag, but it's already fraying, and you can't afford to lose it. Survival's a harsh teacher, and you're learning to hoard your resources, even when the kids' runny noses tug at your guilt. You focus on your own nose, wiping until it burns. As you finish, your nose feels marginally clearer, but it's a hollow victory. You dump the black water into the courtyard cesspit, the basin streaked with grime, and tuck the rag into your pocket, knowing it's not sterile. You pass a neighbor blowing her nose into her apron, her face red and swollen, and the sight's sobering. You're one of the lucky ones with your soap and rag, but even you can't escape the city's grip. The tenement's a germ factory, and every wipe's a small act of defiance. You step outside the street's smoky haze, hitting your nose like a slap. You pass a vendor selling nasal tonics, his bottles filled with dubious liquid, his pitch loud and desperate. You're skeptical. They're probably just watered-down vinegar, and you need real relief, not a scam. The class divide's stark wealthy folks have private doctors and clean wash basins, while you're stuck with a rag and a prayer. Your small arsenal's a lifeline, but it's not enough to outrun the city's filth. The tenement's behind you, but the weight of nasal hygiene lingers, a reminder that in this world, even breathing clearly is a fight for survival, one stinging wipe at a time.